Imagine a time when vast forests stretched endlessly across the land, sacred groves whispered ancient secrets, and the changing seasons marked not just the passage of time, but the heartbeat of a people deeply connected to the earth. This was the world of the Druids, wise, mysterious figures whose knowledge and spirituality shaped the very soul of early Britain and beyond. Yet, as the Roman Empire collapsed and the Dark Ages dawned, their flame seemed destined to fade into shadow and silence. But what if I told you that the Druids never truly disappeared? That beneath the surface of medieval monasteries, tangled myths, and shifting religions, their ancient wisdom quietly endured, woven into stories told by firelight, hidden in the symbols carved on stones, and living on in the rhythms of the land? This is a story not just of loss, but of survival, a journey through the last of the Druids' flame, how ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. The twilight of the Roman Empire was a time of chaos, transformation, and uncertainty. Across Europe, the old orders were crumbling, cities fell silent, trade routes shifted, and the intricate webs of empire unraveled. Among the many traditions to be swallowed in this upheaval was Druidry, the ancient spiritual and cultural system that had flourished for centuries among the Celtic peoples. By the 5th century CE, the Druids, once venerated priests, philosophers, and keepers of sacred knowledge, seemed to vanish from the historical record. The great temples and sacred groves where they had once convened grew quiet. The rich oral traditions, rituals, and wisdom that had defined Druidic life faded from classical accounts, leaving only echoes and whispers. The final classical mentions of Druids, by Roman writers such as Tacitus and Julius Caesar, gave way to new voices, early Christian monks, missionaries, and chroniclers, whose views were often hostile or dismissive. What happened to the Druids? Did their flame die out completely, snuffed by the rise of new religions and empires? Or did something more subtle and resilient persist, hidden beneath the surface of history? The fall of Rome and the quieting of the Druids. To understand the disappearance of the Druids from history, we must first appreciate the context of their world in the waning days of the Roman Empire. During the 1st century CE, Celtic societies in Gaul, modern-day France, Britain, and Ireland had been in varying stages of contact and conflict with Rome. The Romans viewed Druids with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. Julius Caesar, in his commentary De Bello Gallico, depicted Druids as powerful figures who wielded religious, judicial, and even military influence over the tribes. This power threatened Roman authority. Caesar banned Druidic practices in Roman territories and launched military campaigns to suppress them. Temples and sacred sites were destroyed or repurposed. Yet, despite this pressure, Druidic culture survived, especially in regions less accessible to Roman control, like the remote highlands of Britain and Ireland. But as the Roman grip loosened in the 4th and 5th centuries, the empire's collapse brought new challenges. The withdrawal of Roman legions, the incursions of Germanic tribes, and the gradual Christianization of Europe altered the cultural landscape irreversibly. With Christianity's rise as the dominant religion, the old pagan traditions were increasingly marginalized. Christian monks chronicled history from a theological perspective that saw pagan religions as obsolete or even demonic. Druids, once respected as wise spiritual leaders, were now often portrayed as heathens or sorcerers. Fading from the classical record, the last clear classical references to Druids occur in the early centuries CE. Tacitus, the Roman historian writing in the 1st century, lamented the destruction of the sacred groves and the suppression of Druidic rites. But after this, the Druids ceased to appear prominently in written records. The silence is striking. Where once the Druids were described in detail, their rituals, their roles as judges, their vast knowledge of nature and law, now there are only occasional vague or hostile mentions, often from Christian sources intent on discrediting the old beliefs. This absence has long fueled speculation. Did the Druids simply die out? Were their teachings lost forever? Or were they driven underground, their knowledge secreted away in the remote woods and hills? The quiet woods and empty temples. By the early Middle Ages, much of the ancient Celtic world had been transformed. Temples once dedicated to nature deities stood abandoned or converted into Christian churches. Sacred groves, the heart of Druidic worship, were cut down or forgotten. The ancient rites, once performed with great ceremony, ceased to be openly practiced. Yet, the natural world did not forget. The forests and hills that had cradled Druidic wisdom still whispered their secrets to those who would listen. In the quiet places of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, new stories emerged. The figure of the Druid became part legend, part symbol, a mysterious sage living at the edges of society. New voices emerge. The early medieval period saw the rise of Christian monasticism in the Celtic lands. Monks like St. Patrick in Ireland and St. Columba in Scotland became the new spiritual authorities. Yet, in a paradoxical twist, some of these Christian monks preserved elements of earlier Celtic tradition. Their illuminated manuscripts, poetry, and chronicles sometimes echoed the symbolic language and reverence for nature reminiscent of Druidic thought. Moreover, oral traditions continued, passed down by bards and storytellers who remembered the old ways through myth and song. The Druids, though no longer public figures, lived on in these cultural memories. The last flicker of the flame. Far from dying out, the essence of Druidry transformed. The great classical flame did not extinguish, it was sheltered, hidden in the Dark Ages' shadows. Though the Druids' temples were silent and their formal orders dissolved, the wisdom they carried, an intimate knowledge of nature's cycles, an ethical code rooted in balance, a deep respect for the unseen forces shaping life, survived. This survival was quiet, invisible to the chroniclers of the age, but it laid the foundation for the resurgence of Celtic spirituality centuries later. The flame of the Druids, though diminished, was never truly lost. Sacred groves and shifting faiths. The Druids' flame. How ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. As you settle into rest tonight, let your mind drift to a quieter time. One not measured by clocks or screens but by sunrise and mist, wind in the branches, and the slow change of the seasons. In this journey, we wander again into the twilight between ages, where Roman roads have begun to crumble and the world waits, uncertain of what will come next. But amid the ruins, some things remain untouched. The trees still stand, the springs still bubble, the rocks still watch. In this segment, we explore the sacred natural places once held dear by the Druids, groves, wells, and standing stones, and how, remarkably, many of these sites did not vanish with the coming of Christianity. Instead, they adapted, changed names, changed prayers, but often kept the same hush of reverence. Sacredness remained, just dressed differently. Nature as sanctuary, the Druidic worldview. For the Druids, nature was not a neutral backdrop. It was alive. It was conscious, spiritual, inhabited by forces and presences greater than human understanding. The Druidic world was a world of forests and fields, not temples and cities. They held ceremonies beneath the sky, under the shelter of ancient trees, in clearings where sunlight pooled like gold and shadows moved like memory. The oak was sacred, not simply because it was tall and strong, but because it was seen as a bridge between worlds, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the divine. Classical writers, particularly Julius Caesar, recorded that the Druids performed many of their rituals in oak groves. Though Caesar had his own motives, political and military, for describing them, his observations give us valuable hints. Druidic groves, it seems, were not merely physical spaces, they were spiritual thresholds. No walls defined them, no bricks enclosed them. Instead, nature itself formed the sacred architecture. Mist, birdsong, the crunch of leaves underfoot, these were the ambient sounds of ancient worship. And the Druids didn't limit their reverence to trees. Springs, wells, and pools were just as holy. Water was a conduit between worlds. It cleansed, it healed, it carried prayers. Offerings left at sacred wells, coins, beads, carvings, spoke to a deep belief that certain places in nature were imbued with power and consciousness. Many of these sites remained active long after the Druids themselves faded from public life. Why? Because the reverence for them ran deeper than doctrine. These were places where people felt the world thin, where the sacred could be sensed. The blending of old and new, Christianity's arrival. As the Roman Empire retreated from Britain, the stage was slowly set for another powerful spiritual transformation, the spread of Christianity. It didn't arrive all at once, nor did it conquer with fire and sword. In some places, it came quietly, one monk at a time, one story at a time. The early Christian missionaries, especially in Ireland and parts of Western Britain, understood something very important. If they wished to win hearts, they needed to respect the soul of the land. Rather than wipe away the old ways entirely, Christianity often absorbed them. Sacred groves didn't vanish, they became the quiet woodlands near early monastic communities. Springs once dedicated to spirits were rededicated to saints. The great tree where offerings had once been left for the goddess became the yew tree near the church, beneath which burials were made and prayers whispered. The form changed. The feeling remained. One example of this blending is the figure of Brigid. In pagan tradition, Brigid was a goddess of healing, fertility, and fire. She was deeply associated with sacred wells and with the coming of spring. In Christian tradition, Saint Brigid of Kildare emerges with many of the same attributes. Her feast day, February 1st, even aligns with the ancient festival of Imbolc. Scholars and folklorists have long noted that Saint Brigid is, in many ways, a Christianized version of the older goddess, carrying forward older reverence into new religious contexts. Another beautiful example of sacred continuity is seen in wells and springs across Britain and Ireland. These places had always drawn people, whether for healing, divination, or simple reflection. In the Christian era, many became pilgrimage sites. People came to pray, to bathe, to leave offerings, not to old gods, but to saints or to the Virgin Mary. Yet the acts remained the same: hope, gratitude, reverence, all offered beside flowing water. In some places, rags called cluties were tied to trees near the wells, each one representing a wish or a prayer, an act whose roots lie far deeper than medieval Christianity. The architecture of faith also bent to accommodate ancient sites. In many towns and villages, early churches were built near or directly upon places that had long been sacred. A standing stone might be carved with a cross but left standing. A dolmen might be quietly surrounded by Christian graves. Even today, if you visit churches built in the countryside, you may find yourself standing beside yew trees older than the buildings themselves. In some rare cases, like the yew at Fordingal in Scotland, the tree may be over 3,000 years old, suggesting that it witnessed the Druids long before it ever shaded a churchyard. The persistence of sacredness. Why did this happen? Partly, perhaps, because people, no matter the time, recognize the feeling of sacredness. Some places feel holy without needing permission from theology. The rustle of leaves, the shimmer of light on water, the smooth shape of a worn stone. These touch something ancient in us. And when belief systems change, we do not always abandon those feelings. Instead, we reinterpret them. We shift our language. The spirit of the grove becomes the presence of God. The ancient well becomes a holy spring. And so, the sacred persists. This wasn't always a peaceful process, of course. There were times of iconoclasm, times when the church sought to destroy all traces of the old ways. But even then, the land remembered. Oral tradition carried old names. Folklore preserved the gestures and stories. A prayer said before drinking from a spring might sound Christian, but the rhythm of it, the way it's whispered, the turning of the hand, might be older than anyone remembers. We might imagine now a woman in the 7th century, walking through a wooded path to a spring. She carries a candle and a small offering. Her grandmother had walked the same path. Her prayers now speak of saints, not spirits, but her steps follow the same rhythm. She dips her hands in the water, crosses herself, and leaves a flower. The sacred grove has not vanished. It has simply adapted. Even today, remnants of this layered sacredness remain. Places like the Chalice Well at Glastonbury continue to draw pilgrims and spiritual seekers. The well's red waters, rich in iron, have flowed for thousands of years, drawing reverence long before Christian mythos claimed it as the resting place of the Holy Grail. The power of the place does not come from dogma. It comes from presence, from the silence of the garden, the scent of moss, the way the water sounds when it touches stone. This gentle blending of old and new forms one of the most fascinating and soothing parts of the Druidic legacy. It shows us that belief is not always about victory and replacement. Sometimes it is about continuity, about holding on to the sacred even when the stories change. The groves, the wells, the stones, they didn't fight back. They just waited, and in their waiting, they endured. As you rest now, think of those quiet places. Of forests where prayers were once whispered into leaves. Of springs where hands cupped water with reverence. Of stones that marked the turning of the sun. These places still exist, not always with names, but always with presence. And in that stillness, perhaps the Druid's flame flickers still, not in ritual or robe, but in every moment we feel the sacred in the natural world. Pagan rituals in a Christian world. The Druid's flame. how ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. Long after the Druids faded from the public eye, their seasonal rhythms and ceremonial echoes remained deeply embedded in the land and in the hearts of the people. Their rituals were never fully extinguished. Instead, they quietly slipped beneath the surface of a changing world, adapting, shifting, and surviving through the subtle act of cultural camouflage. When Christianity swept through the British Isles, it did not arrive in silence. It came with crosses, scriptures, and saints. But it also came with strategy. Missionaries understood that while people might accept a new god, they would not so easily abandon the sacred flow of the seasons or the rituals that bound their lives to the earth. And so, instead of erasing the old festivals, the new faith absorbed them. Samhain, the veil between worlds. Samhain was among the most sacred festivals of the Celtic year. Falling between the end of October and the beginning of November, it marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, the descent into darkness. It was not merely a seasonal milestone but a profound spiritual gateway. The Celts believed that during Samhain, the veil between the world of the living and the dead grew thin. Spirits roamed freely. Ancestors could be honored or feared. Fires were lit on hills to guide the dead and ward off the unknown. Offerings were left. Cattle were herded between ceremonial flames to bless and protect them. It was a time of endings, thresholds, and transformation. As Christian authorities sought to root their faith in Celtic soil, they made a deliberate move. In the 8th century, the Church shifted All Saints' Day to November 1st, placing it directly atop Samhain. This new holy day honored the saints and martyrs of the Christian faith. The night before, what we now call Halloween, became All Hallows' Eve. It was a calculated replacement. But while the surface changed, the core remained. Many still observed Samhain in their own way, blending new prayers with old customs. Bonfires still lit up the hills. People still dressed in costumes, not to glorify saints, but to confuse or ward off wandering spirits. They carved turnips into ghoulish faces, a practice meant to keep away malevolent beings. Over time, these turnips would become pumpkins in the New World, but the purpose remained the same: protection, remembrance, and recognition of the mysterious otherworld just beyond reach. Beltane, the return of light and life. Beltane, celebrated 6 months opposite Samhain, marked the return of light. Held on May 1st, it ushered in the fertile half of the year. Where Samhain belonged to death and darkness, Beltane sang of life, fertility, and fire. Twin bonfires were lit, and people passed between them for purification and blessing. Couples leapt the flames for luck and love. Herds and flocks were led through smoke to guard them against illness. The festival was wild, joyful, and primal. It was about the turning of the earth, the return of warmth, and the promise of new life. As Christianity gained dominance, Beltane too came under pressure. The Church had no immediate equivalent, and so it took longer to absorb or redirect the celebration. Some Beltane customs were suppressed, but others simply migrated into more acceptable forms. The Maypole dance, for instance, a symbol of growth and union, became a village tradition shorn of its overtly pagan roots. Yet the timing remained. The fire, the joy, the ritual, the essence lingered in local practice. In some regions, people continued to light fires on May Eve well into the 18th and 19th centuries, long after the Church had declared such rites superstitious. Other seasonal festivals and enduring sacredness. Other seasonal festivals, like Imbolc and Lunasa, followed similar paths. Imbolc, in early February, was linked to the goddess Brigid, protector of hearth and home. When Christianity spread, Brigid was not cast aside. Instead, she was canonized as Saint Brigid, and her feast day fell on the same date. Her eternal flame, once tended by pagan priestesses, continued to burn in Kildare under the watch of Christian nuns. Lunasa, the early August festival of harvest, shifted toward church-endorsed blessings of crops and grain, but the older roots remained visible in fairs, feasts, and rural celebrations. Even as Christian theology transformed belief, it could not wholly untether people from the land or from the calendar of the sun and stars. The spiritual relationship between human beings and the natural world was too deep. Sacred wells, once linked to goddesses or spirits, became shrines to saints. Ancient standing stones were renamed but not removed. In many places, early churches were built atop Druidic sites, replacing altars but keeping the location. The holy places endured, even as the stories changed. This process was not always peaceful or harmonious. There were times of suppression, when priests denounced old rites as dangerous or heretical. But in quieter corners, particularly in rural areas, the blend of belief took root in ways that were deeply personal and often invisible to the institutions of power. A mother might pray to Mary at a spring once dedicated to a fertility goddess. A farmer might celebrate the harvest with both a blessing from the local priest and a nod to the old spirits of the field. The faith of the people became a tapestry, threaded with Christian doctrine and Druidic memory alike. The endurance of seasonal festivals is more than just cultural inertia. These rituals gave structure to the year, meaning to community, and a sense of continuity in times of great upheaval. After the fall of Roman rule and the collapse of centralized authority, these festivals became anchors. They were ways of marking time when calendars were rare and literacy was rarer still. They reminded people that the world turned, that winter would end, that death was followed by life. In this sense, the flame of Druidic wisdom flickered not in secret texts or lost temples, but in the fire festivals that continued to warm the dark. By the time medieval chroniclers recorded the world around them, much of this blending had already taken place. Few wrote about it directly, perhaps because they didn't recognize it, or perhaps because it had become so normal it no longer seemed remarkable. But folklore, customs, and rural traditions preserved it. In poems, songs, and seasonal fairs, echoes of the Druids survived. Their rituals didn't vanish, they evolved. Today, when we celebrate Halloween or dance around a maypole, we are participating in something ancient. We light candles, tell ghost stories, and honor the cycles of life and death, not always knowing that beneath these acts lie memories thousands of years old. The faces may change, the names may fade, but the rhythm remains. The Druid's flame did not go out. It simply found new shapes in which to burn. The oral tradition, stories told by firelight. The Druid's flame, how ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. In a time before books, before printing presses, before ink-stained parchment with permanence, there was memory and fire. Across the hills and valleys of ancient Britain, the stories of a people lived in the mouths of poets, passed from voice to voice like breath. In the glow of hearths and under the stars, tales were spoken, not read. The Druidic world, though so much of it now lies veiled in shadow, was not a silent one. It was rich with language, with recitation, and with the living rhythm of spoken word. And in this fragile yet enduring tradition, knowledge passed through generations like flame jumping from torch to torch, never static, always alive. The Druids, whose influence once stretched across the Celtic world, did not write their secrets down. Their lore was sacred and guarded. They believed that the most important truths were too powerful to be committed to writing. To write them would risk corruption or misuse. So instead, they memorized. Years, sometimes decades, were spent training the mind to hold vast tapestries of myth, astronomy, healing, history, and law. The oral tradition was their library, their classroom, their archive. A Druid might carry within them entire genealogies, calendars of the stars, or the rules for healing plants and sacred rites. This was knowledge not stored on shelves but held in the chambers of the mind, sharpened by repetition and ritual. The bards were their kin. If the Druids were priests and judges, the bards were poets and historians. Their role was no less vital. A bard could elevate a hero's name or destroy it. Their songs carried the weight of memory and honor. Through elegies, praise poems, and tales of valor, they stitched the deeds of a people into the fabric of time. Even kings depended on them, for remembrance, for legacy, for legitimacy. A bard's words could outlive empires. In the Celtic world, to be forgotten was a worse fate than death. And so, the bard preserved. As Roman influence receded and Christian monasticism rose, a curious overlap began to occur. Though early Christianity often sought to suppress pagan customs, it shared a similar reverence for the spoken word. In monasteries that clung to the edges of the world, in Ireland, in Wales, in the far north of Britain, monks began to write. But what they wrote was not only scripture. They recorded legends, songs, and genealogies. Many of these had once been spoken only by bards or remembered in Druidic circles. And though the scribes wrote with Christian intent, they preserved more than they knew. The Labor Gabála Éireann, or Book of Invasions, is one such example. Compiled by Irish monks, it tells the mythical history of Ireland, waves of settlers, heroes, gods, and battles. It is Christian in tone, but underneath lies a deep current of ancient myth. The names of deities, the cycles of the seasons, and the echoes of older, Druidic cosmology remain within its lines. What had once been whispered by firelight was now inked onto vellum, but it had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. And still, many stories remained alive not on pages but in voices. In homes and halls, in fields and byways, people continued to tell. Grandmothers whispered tales of the Bean Sidhe, the wailing woman who heralded death. Hunters spoke of fairy paths and stones that walked by moonlight. Farmers passed on the knowledge of sacred herbs and the timing of the seasons. These were not merely tales, they were maps, instructions, and warnings. Oral tradition remained the lifeblood of communities that had little else to guide them. To sit by the fire was to enter a world of memory. The crackle of wood, the slow build of a tale, the subtle performance of voice and gesture, this was an art form shaped over generations. A good storyteller was more than a performer. They were a keeper of time. They knew when to pause, when to let silence speak, when to let the story breathe. These were not just entertainments, they were acts of preservation. Through them, the ancient past stayed tethered to the present. Even the rhythms of the stories held meaning. Repetition, rhyme, and alliteration were tools for memory. These patterns, easy to recall and pass on, helped ideas travel across distance and time. In this way, myth survived not despite illiteracy, but because of it. The spoken word was flexible, adaptable. It could evolve with each telling, bending to fit a new time while still holding the shape of the old. And so, Druidic wisdom, though never written by Druids themselves, was not lost. It was absorbed into the fabric of cultural memory. In bardic poetry, in folk tales, in seasonal rituals, and even in the texts of Christian monks, pieces of the old world endured. The monastic scribes may not have always understood the origins of the stories they wrote, but in copying them, they became accidental allies to the oral tradition. They took the ephemeral and made it visible. And in doing so, they helped the Druidic flame persist. There is something deeply human in the act of storytelling. It binds people together across time and geography. When everything else collapses, empires, temples, kingdoms, stories remain. They outlast stones. They echo in the mind long after the speaker is gone. And for the people of post-Roman Britain, facing invasion, famine, and uncertainty, the story was sometimes all they had. In Welsh mythology, the figure of Taliesin stands as a bridge between worlds. A poet of divine inspiration, a prophet, a shaper of language, his legend straddles the realms of Druid, Bard, and Mystic. Though he lived in the 6th century, long after the classical Druids, Taliesin's mythic persona is filled with ancient power. His songs are spells. His transformations echo the old gods. In him, we see how the oral tradition could carry the spirit of Druidic thought far beyond its supposed end. Even into the high medieval period, courts across Ireland, Wales, and Scotland still employed bards. Their verses were prized. They carried echoes of an age that had not vanished but had slipped beneath the waves of time. Some of these poets continued to pass down older myths, threading them into contemporary praise or lament. Through them, the ancestral voice remained alive. Today, much of what we know about the ancient Celts and their spiritual worldview comes not from ruins or artifacts, but from these oral survivals. From tales told in kitchens and forests. From verses whispered in stone churches that stood on land once sacred to oak and mistletoe. From stories that crossed centuries like seeds on the wind. The Druid's flame lived in memory, not in monument. It glowed in the stories carried on the breath of the living. And through the sacred art of storytelling, be it bardic, folk, or monastic, the wisdom of a people who would not write still found a way to endure. Their words were not chiseled in stone, but they were carried in song. Not carved in wood, but spoken in rhythm. Not seen, but remembered. And still, when the fire is low and the night is long, there are places where the old tales rise again, familiar and strange, echoing like voices from a far and ancient time. Druids and monks, the battle for memory. The Druid's flame. How ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. Long before the carved crosses of monasteries rose over the green hills of Britain and Ireland, the forests echoed with the low chants of Druids. Clad in white, guided by the stars and the rhythms of the land, they tended to memory not with ink, but with ritual, song, and silence. Their temples were groves, their scrolls were minds trained in the sacred art of recollection. They were the lore keepers of an oral world, guardians of a truth not written but lived. Then came the monks. Clad in simple robes, eyes lowered, voices raised in Latin hymns, they brought a different order of memory, one that relied on ink, parchment, and sacred texts preserved in cloistered rooms. Where Druids looked to the stars and sacred springs, the monks looked to scripture. Where Druids feared the written word might imprison wisdom, monks believed it could preserve truth forever. Each path sought to remember, but in ways the other did not trust. The uneasy coexistence. At first, their coexistence was uneasy. In the early centuries after Rome's withdrawal, the boundaries between old faith and new were still porous. Pagan rites had not vanished, they had only gone quieter, less public. There were places where Druids still practiced in secret, where old festivals continued under new names, and where bards walked both worlds, chanting prayers in Christian courts, yet carrying echoes of older stories in their hearts. The monks, too, were not always hostile. In Ireland especially, the early church grew in a landscape already rich with spiritual tradition. Many monks had been raised among the bards and healers, and some found the old knowledge too valuable to discard. They adapted instead. Holy wells once dedicated to forest goddesses became the wells of saints. Sacred oaks were not felled, but reinterpreted. And some monasteries were built on land that had once echoed with Druidic rites, their stones laid in silent conversation with the past. Still, tension remained. The monks viewed memory as something to be safeguarded in libraries. They were the scribes of salvation, convinced that eternity lay in the written word. They copied not just scripture, but laws, genealogies, and poems. And though they preserved a great deal of oral culture, they also filtered it, casting older gods as demons, renaming spirits, and reshaping myth to fit Christian cosmology. What was remembered came with commentary. A quiet battle for memory. The Druids, though their presence faded from records, lived on in the shadows of these choices. While their official roles were outlawed or dissolved, their echoes remained in the oral traditions that monks sometimes transcribed but rarely fully understood. To the Christian scribes, a poem was a text. To the bard, it was a living breath. To the Druid, it was a sacred act. Over time, the difference between remembering and recording became a quiet battleground. Memory, once a living inheritance, was gradually transformed into manuscript. The act of writing fixed things, solidified versions, named authors, drew lines between fact and fable. What had once been fluid, adaptable, and communal became static, bound in vellum and archived in stone buildings where the seasons no longer dictated the telling of tales. Yet this was not a war of destruction, but of transformation. Though the monks may have sought to preserve doctrine, they also preserved a great many things they didn't entirely understand. The stories they recorded, of Fionn Mac Cumhaill, of Cu Chulainn, of shape-shifting poets and prophetic stones, were not wholly Christian. They carried the scent of an older world, a druidic breath behind the ink. These monks, perhaps unknowingly, became stewards of a flame they were never meant to carry. The enduring flame. The Druid's flame did not go out. It flickered in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. It hid in metaphors and slipped between verses. It was not the flame of temples or grand institutions, but a hearth fire, small, persistent, quietly tended by those who remembered how the old songs went. In bards who trained in monasteries. In farmers who lit fires at Beltane. In healers who still gathered herbs by the moon. The blending of traditions became more than survival. It was a kind of reconciliation. A monk might copy a pagan tale not because he believed it, but because he saw in it a reflection of something worth preserving. A bard might praise the Christian God with verses that still followed the rhythm of the old triads. And within these overlaps, something powerful emerged, a hybrid memory. One not fully pagan, nor wholly Christian, but deeply human. This battle for memory was not won or lost. It simply changed the battlefield. It moved from grove to scriptorium, from firelight to candlelight, from spoken breath to written word. But the heart of it, the need to remember, to carry meaning across generations, remained untouched. In the end, Druids and monks were not so different. Both saw knowledge as sacred. Both devoted their lives to preserving what mattered. And both, in their own ways, helped ensure that the wisdom of the past would not vanish in the chaos of the ages. They were guardians of memory, walking different paths toward the same horizon. And that is how, even now, fragments of ancient wisdom survive, not just in the books we read or the ruins we visit, but in the stories we still tell when the night grows long and the fire burns low. The mystical landscape, sacred places and their secrets. The Druid's flame, how ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. Long before maps had names for them, certain places drew people in. Not by power or wealth, but by something older, something felt. A resonance, a hush. Across the ancient landscape of Britain, from the chalky plains of Wiltshire to the mist-veiled hills of Glastonbury, there existed sites that people didn't just visit, they revered them. They gathered, built, worshipped, and returned again and again, as if drawn by the land itself. Stonehenge, towering and strange, even in its ruin. Its stones, hauled across vast distances, arranged with astronomical precision, still defy a complete explanation. Scholars debate its use, temple, calendar, burial ground, but for those who lived in its shadow thousands of years ago, it was more than a monument. It was a place of presence. A place where sky met earth and silence had meaning. Long after its builders were gone, its mystery remained, and that mystery was inherited. Druidic reverence for nature's thresholds. The Druids, centuries later, did not build Stonehenge, but they understood the language of such places. They knew that certain spots on the land hummed with energy, sacred groves, windswept hills, clear springs rising from the earth. These were not just natural features, they were thresholds, places where the veil between worlds grew thin. They held their ceremonies where trees arched like cathedral ceilings, where stones whispered of time, and where water mirrored the sky. Glastonbury was one such place, a hill that rises like an island in the mists, crowned now by a lonely tower. In Christian legend, it became the Isle of Avalon, resting place of Arthur. But its roots stretch deeper. The Druids knew it as Ynys Witrin, the Glass Island, a place of visions and transformation. Springs bubbled with iron-rich water, said to have healing powers. And somewhere in the interweaving myths of druids, saints, and seekers, Glastonbury became timeless. A sacred point where old gods, Christian saints, and questing kings all seemed to touch the same earth. Throughout the land, other sacred sites endured. Avebury, older and more expansive than Stonehenge, encircled by standing stones that still gaze over grazing sheep. Silbury Hill, a man-made mound so vast and labor-intensive that its purpose remains a mystery. Holy wells with names that changed over time, from Brigid to Mary, from goddess to saint. Each site, layered like sediment, telling stories in silence. Christian absorption and enduring sacredness. The Christian world did not ignore these places, it absorbed them. Monasteries were built near old sacred hills. Chapels sprang up beside ancient wells. Crosses were raised on former pagan grounds. But the land remembered. Pilgrims still felt the tug of mystery in the soil, even if the names had changed. Sacredness, it turned out, was hard to erase. It simply shifted shape, and beneath these transformations, the old knowledge persisted. Local people, whose ancestors had honored the spirits of the land, continued to mark solstices and equinoxes. They walked the paths of their forebears, gathering at ancient sites not just out of habit, but out of instinct. The feeling hadn't faded, it had just become quieter. The mystical landscape was never just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. The Druids had no need to carve scripture into stone because the land itself was the scripture. They walked the hills not only as terrain but as text, each spring and grove a line in a living poem. This way of seeing didn't disappear with the arrival of new religions. It adapted. It endured. Even in the Dark Ages, when warlords battled and kingdoms rose and fell, the land remained constant. It whispered its truths to those still willing to listen. The monks who chronicled Christian saints often included nature's miracles, wells that healed, stones that spoke, animals that acted as guides. The pagan sense of sacred space crept quietly into the Christian worldview, wrapped in new language but still rooted in the same awe. A timeless presence. To visit these places today is to step into that layered time. The stones still stand, the springs still bubble, the air still carries the hush that once drew entire tribes to gather and mark the turning of the sun. You do not need to understand the rituals to feel the pull. These are not just ruins or relics, they are conversations across centuries. Echoes of a worldview that held nature, time, and spirit as one. In the great tapestry of history, sacred landscapes are the background threads, steady, often unnoticed, yet shaping the entire design. While kings ruled and battles raged, the stones watched in silence. While monks prayed in cloisters, the hills held older prayers. While memory shifted from bard to book, the land kept its own record. One not written in words, but in presence. And so the Druid's flame, that ancient reverence for place and mystery, endures. It flickers in the morning mist over Glastonbury, in the chill shadow of Stonehenge at dawn, in the hush beside a nameless spring in a quiet forest. These sacred places are not lost. They are waiting, just as they always have, for those who are still willing to look, listen, and remember. The rise of Merlin, legend born from Druidic roots. The Druid's flame, how ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. In the shadowy forests of early Britain, long before printed books or royal crests, a figure began to take shape, part man, part myth. He wore no crown, bore no sword, and claimed no kingdom. Yet he stood beside kings, spoke with beasts, and knew the language of stars and trees. His name was Merlin, and though his legend would become one of the most enduring in Western literature, its roots lie far deeper than the pages of medieval romances. They reach back to the whispering groves of the Druids, to a time when wisdom was carried in the wind and truth passed from mouth to ear beneath the open sky. Merlin Wilt, the wild prophet. Merlin was not born into castles or carved from stone. He was born of story, an evolving memory of the old world. Early Welsh texts speak of Merlin Wilt, a wild prophet driven mad by battle, retreating into the forest where he lived among animals and communed with nature. This Merlin, older than Arthurian courtly tales, was no magician in a pointed hat. He was a seer of the woods, a man of visions, a bridge between the human world and the unseen forces of the earth. He echoed the Druids, those shadowy figures who stood on sacred hills and whispered to oak leaves for answers. Like them, he was attuned to the rhythms of the land, the stars, and the soul. Transformation and enduring echoes. As Christianity spread across Britain, stories needed to shift. Pagan figures were softened or reshaped to fit new values. But Merlin proved hard to tame. Instead of being erased, he was transformed. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century writings, he emerges more fully formed, part prophet, part advisor, shaping the destiny of Britain through counsel, foresight, and magic. Yet even then, the forest clung to him. He was never quite civilized, never fully courtly. He still belonged, in part, to the wild. The Druids had no written scripture, but they had stories, and those stories, carried through generations, seeded the myth of Merlin. His connection to animals, to weather, to fate itself, all mirrored the powers attributed to ancient Druidic seers. The ability to see beyond the veil of time. The communion with trees and stones. The sense that wisdom came not from books, but from listening, to the earth, to silence, to the soul's deeper knowing. Merlin's duality made him irresistible to medieval writers. He was both inside and outside the world of men. He spoke the language of kings, yet preferred the solitude of the forest. He wielded knowledge rather than weapons. In him, the medieval imagination found a figure that connected two worlds, the rational and the mystical, the sacred and the wild, the past and the present. Through him, the echoes of Druidic tradition survived not just in rituals or sacred sites, but in narrative. A living legacy. What is remarkable is not just that Merlin endured, but that he evolved. As each century passed, he changed shape, reflecting the hopes and fears of those who told his story. Yet through all the versions, court wizard, wild prophet, tragic hermit, something remained. A trace of the older world. A sense of reverence for mystery. A belief that the land itself holds wisdom for those who know how to listen. In a time when many traditions were forgotten or overwritten, Merlin's story carried something forward. Not just entertainment, but memory. The memory of a time when knowledge came from stars and stones, when truth was spoken in riddles, and when wisdom had no temple but the earth itself. His legend became a vessel, carrying the Druid's flame across centuries, not in secret, but in plain sight. Even today, Merlin continues to reappear, in novels, films, and imaginations. Sometimes wise, sometimes whimsical, always otherworldly. But beneath each retelling lies the same root, the ancient figure in the forest, listening to the wind, speaking to trees, and guarding truths too old to name. In Merlin, we do not just meet a character. We encounter a memory, a living echo of Britain's mystical past. Healing and herb lore, the Druidic legacy in medicine. Before apothecaries, before physicians in academic robes, before the sterile tinctures of modern medicine, there were herbs, wild and fragrant, rooted in soil, kissed by rain, and guarded by memory. And there were those who knew their ways. For the ancient Druids, healing was not merely physical. It was spiritual, seasonal, and deeply tied to the rhythms of nature. To know a plant was to know its story, its spirit, and its purpose. This knowledge, passed in whispers and rituals, was never written in books. Yet somehow, it survived. The enduring green light of healing. Across the shadowed centuries that followed Rome's departure, Britain entered what many would call the Dark Ages. But in its fields and hedgerows, light still lingered, green and growing. While kingdoms clashed and faiths collided, the quiet work of healing continued. At the heart of this endurance was the fusion of two worlds, the herbal wisdom of the old ways, and the spiritual framework of the new Christian order. The monks who walked cloistered gardens, hands calloused from digging soil, often tended the same plants their pagan ancestors had gathered under moonlight. Yarrow to staunch wounds, willow bark for pain, nettle to stir the blood. These were not secrets, they were survival. And though the rituals surrounding them might shift, from invoking the goddess to murmuring a saint's name, the plants remained. Their power, unchanged. Medieval herbals, carefully copied by hand in scriptoria, often echoed knowledge far older than their pages. They included remedies rooted in experience, observation, and lore carried from Druidic memory to bardic verse, then woven into monastic routine. One of the most remarkable testaments to this continuity was the Leech Book of Bald, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon medical text. Within its vellum pages, one finds not just Christian prayers, but instructions for treating ailments using plant-based cures, many of which mirrored Druidic remedies. Garlic, mugwort, fennel, betony. These plants had served healers for centuries, their use passed quietly through generations who understood that health was part of harmony, with nature, with spirit, with the self. Monasteries and wise women as keepers of knowledge. It is tempting to think that the Christianization of Britain wiped the slate clean. But the truth is more nuanced. Rather than extinguish Druidic healing traditions, the new religious structures absorbed them. Monasteries became sanctuaries not only for prayer, but for medicine. Their gardens were curated with care, blending Roman medicinal plants with native British flora. The monks became the new keepers of green knowledge, though the language they used to frame it had changed. What was once sacred to the Earth Mother was now offered to God's service. Women, too, played a crucial role. In secluded villages and scattered homesteads, wise women, the successors of Druidic herb wives, kept healing traditions alive. They harvested roots and leaves under the same stars, brewed salves and teas, and whispered charms over fevers. Some would be honored as healers. Others would later face suspicion and persecution. But through their hands, the herbal knowledge lived on. They remembered what plants flowered after frost, which ones needed a blade of silver to harvest, which required a whispered word to release their strength. Certain plants carried special reverence. Mistletoe, sacred to the Druids, remained a symbol of mystery and healing. Though its religious significance evolved, its association with protection endured. Vervain, once used in Druidic rites, found new life in Christian blessings. Even the oak, mighty and venerated, continued to be seen as a tree of life, its bark and acorns employed in remedies and symbol alike. The language may have changed, but the reverence had not. The enduring legacy of holistic healing. The transmission of herbal knowledge was rarely linear. It was fluid, like water finding its path. Bards and monks, midwives and scribes, each preserved fragments. Some in rhyme, others in script. By firelight, in quiet cloisters, across battlefields and burial mounds, the knowledge was kept alive not because it was sacred, but because it worked. A poultice could close a wound. A tisane could calm a fever. When survival is at stake, wisdom endures. And yet, the healing traditions were never purely medicinal. For the Druids, to heal a body was to restore balance to the whole. They viewed illness not just as a disruption of flesh, but as a disturbance in the harmony of nature. Medieval Christian healers, in their own way, adopted this view, seeing sin and sickness as intertwined, and healing as both physical and spiritual renewal. Thus, prayer accompanied potion. Ritual met remedy. and the soul was treated alongside the skin. Even today, remnants of this ancient knowledge persist. In folk medicine, in botanical studies, in the resurgence of herbalism. Walk the hedgerows of Britain, and you will find the same plants once gathered by druids and monks alike. Meadowsweet, chamomile, valerian, they grow still, unchanged, waiting to be remembered. And in that remembrance lies the flame, flickering, persistent, alive. The legacy of Druidic healing is not just about plants. It is about relationship, a way of seeing the natural world not as a resource, but as a partner. The earth as teacher, the forest as pharmacy, the wind as whisperer of secrets. This worldview, deeply embedded in the Druidic tradition, survived precisely because it was never fully written down. It lived in gardens, in gestures, in generations of hands reaching into the soil. And so, in the herbal lore of the medieval world, we glimpse a lineage that defies easy erasure. The Druids did not leave behind libraries, but they left behind wisdom, woven into the landscape, hidden in roots and leaves, and carried in the memory of those who tended them. The monks may have worn robes instead of cloaks, and their chants may have echoed in stone chapels instead of oak groves. But in their care for plants, in their belief in the healing power of nature, they continued a much older tradition. This is the quiet miracle of the Druids' flame. It did not burn out. It adapted, glowing softly in herb gardens and monastery walls, in forest clearings and village kitchens. And through the long centuries of change, war, and forgetting, it never truly died. It lived on in every hand that reached for healing, not just with knowledge, but with reverence. The language of symbols, runes, knots, and signs. The Druids' flame. How ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. Before written language crystallized into the Roman alphabet, before parchment bore inked chronicles of kings and saints, the people of ancient Britain understood the world through symbols. Marks carved in wood and stone, knots tied in thread, patterns scratched in dirt. This was the visual language of memory, of protection, of meaning. The Druids, revered as wisdom keepers, knew these symbols not just as decorations, but as conduits of power. They were maps of belief, whispers of cosmos, tools of ritual and communication. Runes and their potent meanings. Runes were among the oldest of these signs, angular, sharp, and mysterious. Each rune was more than a letter. It was a concept, a force. The Futhark, as the runic alphabet was called, contained symbols that spoke of cattle, gifts, journeys, and the gods themselves. For the Druids and their northern counterparts, runes were not simply inscribed, they were activated. A carved rune on a blade or boundary stone could bless or curse. When traced in ash, they became spells. When murmured aloud, they were prayers. The line between language and magic was thin, and symbols walked that line with quiet potency. As Christianity spread across Britain, many of these symbols were denounced as pagan, even dangerous. Yet paradoxically, some were absorbed and transformed. The early medieval church, recognizing the human need for symbol and sign, did not banish all of them outright. Instead, new meanings were overlaid. Old symbols became Christian emblems. A knot that once invoked protection from forest spirits now adorned a gospel manuscript as a symbol of eternity. The sacred language adapted, but it did not disappear. Celtic knots and ancient cosmologies. Nowhere is this more evident than in the intricate knots of Celtic art. Found carved in stone, woven into jewelry, and painted into illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, these looping designs echo an older understanding of the universe, one without beginning or end. Endless paths, interwoven fates. For the Druids, who saw time as cyclical and life as interconnected, such patterns expressed profound truths. When Christian scribes adopted these forms into manuscript borders and reliquaries, they inherited more than style. They preserved a worldview. The knotwork, spirals, and triskelions that adorned early medieval art were not mere ornamentation. They were symbolic expressions of continuity, of the unseen forces binding the world together. The spirals, single, double, and triple, spoke of life, death, and rebirth. Of land, sea, and sky. Of body, mind, and spirit. These ancient cosmologies, carved into megaliths long before Rome arrived, found new life in Christian contexts. The triquetra, for instance, 3 interlaced arcs, became a symbol of the Holy Trinity. But its roots run deeper, older, wilder. The symbols also appeared in the mundane, carved on thresholds, painted on cradles, etched into the handles of tools. Folk traditions held that certain patterns could ward off evil or bring fortune. In villages and hill forts, people still marked doorposts with sigils, sometimes Christian crosses, sometimes a star, sometimes a looping motif passed down without a name. These signs may not have been consciously Druidic, yet they carried echoes of that earlier wisdom. The belief that a shape could hold meaning, that a sign could protect, that a mark could speak when words failed. Sacred geography and Ogham script. Sacred geography, too, was mapped in symbol. Standing stones were often placed in patterns aligned with celestial events. The Druidic understanding of the stars and seasons found visual expression in circular arrangements, radial alignments, and labyrinthine paths. Later, these concepts were mirrored in the rose windows of cathedrals and the floor mosaics of abbeys. Circles within circles. Light through colored glass. The symbolic mapping of the heavens remained, even as the gods changed names. And there were the Ogham lines, a uniquely Celtic script made of notches and slashes, often carved along the edges of stones or wooden staffs. The Ogham alphabet was deeply tied to the natural world. Each character was associated with a tree: birch, ash, alder, yew. To read Ogham was to read the forest. It was a language of druids, bards, and initiates. Though it faded from common use, traces of Ogham persisted in bardic lore, in the naming of trees, in whispered charms. It was another thread in the tapestry of symbolic communication, a quiet code from a lost forest of meaning. In the monasteries of the Dark Ages, scribes illuminated manuscripts with golden swirls and zoomorphic creatures. These embellishments were not frivolous. They were acts of devotion, yes, but also inheritances. The style of the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Durrow reveals a dialogue between Christian theology and Celtic visual language. Amid prayers in Latin, one sees the old shapes, spirals, knots, sacred beasts, woven together like incantations in ink. The page became a sacred space where memory and belief intertwined. Enduring meaning in form. Symbols have always been bridges, between people, between past and present, between the visible and invisible. In early medieval Britain, where Druidic knowledge was fading yet not forgotten, symbols became vessels. Through them, ancient wisdom traveled unnoticed across the centuries. A child tracing spirals in the dirt. A monk drawing a knot in the margin of a psalm. A mason carving a circle into a church lintel. Each gesture passed the flame forward. Even in later centuries, during times of renewed suspicion toward anything pagan, the old symbols remained resilient. Some were hidden in plain sight. Others lived in lullabies, in embroidery, in the shapes of talismans hung over doors. The magic, if not understood, was still felt. Because symbols do not rely on language alone. They speak to something deeper. A memory below memory. A story told not in words, but in patterns of light and shadow, form and feeling. Today, we still feel drawn to these ancient marks. Tattooed on skin, carved into jewelry, painted on canvas, they continue to carry meaning. Not always the same meanings they once held, but always with the same weight. Their survival is a testament to the resilience of visual language, to the way humans seek meaning in shape, in pattern, in mystery, and to the quiet, persistent fire of the Druidic legacy, still glowing beneath the surface of our modern world. These symbols, runes, knots, spirals, sigils, remind us that knowledge does not always arrive as words. Sometimes it comes as a shape, a rhythm, a line drawn in sand. And sometimes, that's enough to keep the flame alive. The Druid's flame in Celtic poetry. The Druid's flame. How ancient wisdom survived the Dark Ages. Long after the sacred groves fell silent and the great gatherings of the Druids had faded into myth, something of their spirit lingered in the songs that echoed through the valleys of Britain and Ireland. Though the rituals may have been outlawed and the oaken staffs forgotten, the voice of the Druids did not vanish entirely. It changed form. It took shelter in rhyme and rhythm, in meter and melody, in the breath of the poet. Where memory once relied on firelit oration, now it rode the waves of verse. Poetry became the ember that kept the Druids' flame alive. The bardic inheritance, keepers of tradition. Celtic poetry is not merely a reflection of beauty, sorrow, or love. It is a coded inheritance, passed through generations by bards whose role was far greater than mere entertainers. In the ancient Celtic world, poets, known as Philid in Ireland and Bard in Wales, were the guardians of tradition, history, and law. Their craft was revered, feared, and even protected by statute. A true bard was a living archive, carrying in their mind the stories, genealogies, and spiritual insights of a people whose identity depended on oral memory. The Druids may have once presided over courts and rites, but it was the poets who ensured their legacy survived the shifting sands of time. The structure of Celtic poetry was never accidental. Its rhythm was designed to anchor memory. Its metaphors acted as mnemonic devices. Every turn of phrase, every internal rhyme, every alliteration served not only to stir emotion, but to preserve information. Within these layers, the old teachings endured, transformed, perhaps, by the Christian world in which they now lived, but still flickering with the wisdom of the oak and the stone. The triadic verse forms often used in these poems echoed the ancient Druidic worldview, which saw the universe through the lens of threes: land, sea, and sky, birth, life, and death, body, mind, and spirit. Voices from the manuscripts, Taliesin and ancient myths. In the early medieval period, as monastic centers blossomed and scribes began recording the oral traditions of Ireland and Wales, these poems were finally committed to vellum. But the words they preserved were ancient already, honed over centuries of oral recitation. The Book of Taliesin in Wales and the Book of Leinster in Ireland are among the oldest and most potent windows into this lyrical past. Through them, we meet figures like Taliesin himself, a legendary bard whose voice echoes with druidic depth, speaking in riddles, invoking transformation, and hinting at mysteries older than the stones of Stonehenge. Taliesin's verses, though often cryptic, pulse with the language of shape-shifting, prophecy, and divine memory. He claims to have been a hawk, a salmon, a wave, a sword. These are not mere poetic flourishes, they reflect a spiritual philosophy where identity was fluid, where wisdom came through immersion in the natural world, where to know something was to become it. This worldview, so deeply embedded in Taliesin's imagery, bears the unmistakable influence of Druidic cosmology. Even within a Christianized framework, the poems preserved a shimmering echo of the old path. Irish poetic traditions carried similar undertones. In the Labor Gabála Éireann, the Book of Invasions, myth blends with history, and the stories of divine ancestors and magical races are laced with verses that feel ritualistic, incantatory. The poem, Amra Caluum Chili, an elegy for the sainted Columba, follows the tradition of bardic mourning that stretches back to the funerary chants of the pagan past. Here again, Christian themes mingle with older forms. In fact, the early Irish Church, recognizing the deep cultural roots of bardic poetry, allowed much of it to flourish, even encouraging the use of poetic praise and elegy in religious devotion. And so, even as the Druidic class was outlawed, their intellectual descendants found refuge in monasteries. Many monks were trained in the bardic tradition, and their verses often carry subtle nods to the sacredness of nature, the interconnection of life, and the importance of memory, all hallmarks of Druidic philosophy. The line between monk and poet, between Christian and Druid, was not always sharp. In many cases, it blurred into a shared reverence for the power of the spoken word. Music, social function, and lasting legacy. Music played a vital role in this tradition. Harps, lyres, and pipes accompanied the verses, creating a sensory experience that deepened the emotional resonance of the words. Music had always been a Druidic tool, used in ritual, in healing, in meditation, and its continuation in bardic performance was no accident. Sound itself was sacred. The cadence of a chant, the vibration of a string, the rise and fall of melody, they were all seen as ways to access higher truths, to call upon forces beyond the visible world. In poetry, the song carried the spirit. Much of this poetry also served a practical social function. Bards were called upon to satirize unjust rulers, to praise heroes, to commemorate battles. But even in these civic duties, the deeper philosophies lingered. A well-crafted satire could invoke the ancient belief in the magical potency of words. A poem was not just description, it could bless, curse, inspire, or dismantle. In this sense, the poet retained something of the Druid's role as spiritual arbiter and guardian of moral balance. Over time, as literacy spread and the role of oral tradition diminished, the sacred role of poetry waned. Yet the verses endured. They were copied into manuscripts, studied by scholars, sung in households, and eventually reawakened by later poets and folklorists seeking to reclaim a lost heritage. Figures of the Romantic period, like William Blake and W.B. Yeats, looked back toward the Celtic bard as a symbol of mystical wisdom and ancient memory. In their works, the Druid's flame flickered once more, no longer in oak groves, but on printed pages and theatrical stages. Even today, in the modern revival of Celtic spirituality, poetry remains central. Neo-Druidic circles often open rituals with invocations in verse. Celtic festivals celebrate the bardic arts with competitions, storytelling, and song. There is a recognition, conscious or not, that in poetry, the ancestral voice speaks most clearly. The flame that once lit the faces of gathered tribes in the firelight now dances in the syllables of a chant, a lyric, a whispered line. In the end, poetry is memory. Not just of facts or events, but of feeling, belief, worldview. Through Celtic poetry, the soul of a people survived. Through the careful, reverent crafting of verse, the philosophies that once animated the Druids continued to breathe. In symbols, in rhythm, in metaphor, they found shelter. And in the act of recitation, whether by a robed bard before a chieftain or a child repeating a lullaby, the ancient light never fully went out. The Druid's flame, though forbidden, burned in the quiet corners of the heart. It flickered in the cadence of a verse, in the hush after a rhyme. It rose in the voice of a poet reaching back through time, not to reconstruct the past exactly, but to honor it. To carry forward its mystery. To say, in words too old to name, we remember. We still hear you, and your light still warms us. The Christianization of Ireland, a gentle transformation. The Christianization of Ireland was far from a sudden rupture. It was instead a subtle and gradual transformation that blended new beliefs with ancient traditions, creating a rich tapestry of spiritual life that echoed the past while charting a new course for the future. Unlike the often brutal conquests and forced conversions seen elsewhere in Europe, Ireland's journey toward Christianity unfolded with a unique gentleness, a negotiation between the old and the new rather than a violent overthrow. This process did not erase the Druids overnight or erase the pagan worldview, but rather allowed many of its elements to persist and transform within a Christian framework. The Druids, once revered as the spiritual leaders and custodians of ancient wisdom, gradually gave way to Christian monks and bishops, yet their legacy did not vanish. It adapted, infused with fresh meaning and new symbols. A gradual conversion and accommodation. Ireland's conversion began in earnest in the 5th century, often associated with the missionary work of St. Patrick, though the reality was far more complex and gradual than legend suggests. Patrick himself was a product of both worlds. He was educated in the Christian tradition abroad but returned to an Ireland still deeply rooted in its native beliefs. His approach was one of accommodation and integration. Instead of outright condemning the old faith, Patrick and other early missionaries sought to find points of connection, adapting Christian teachings to the cultural and spiritual landscape of Ireland. Sacred wells, ancient trees, and holy places that once served as Druidic sites were reconsecrated as Christian shrines. Pagan festivals were reinterpreted and aligned with the Christian calendar, ensuring continuity and easing the transition for the people. Blending symbolism and preserving oral traditions. This gentle transformation is most evident in the way that Irish Christian art and ritual absorbed Druidic symbolism. The intricate interlacing patterns found in illuminated manuscripts such as the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels are widely believed to have roots in ancient Celtic knotwork, a visual language of eternity and interconnectedness that resonated deeply with the old Druidic worldview. The cross itself, a symbol of Christianity, often incorporates these traditional Celtic motifs, blending the sacred geometry of the old with the new faith. This synthesis speaks to a society that did not see Christianity and the native spiritual traditions as inherently opposed but rather as parts of a continuum. The monks who produced these masterpieces were likely steeped in the memory of the land's spiritual past, deliberately weaving it into their Christian devotion. Monastic communities became the new centers of learning and spirituality in Ireland, succeeding the Druids as keepers of wisdom. These monasteries preserved not only Christian scripture but also the oral traditions, myths, and histories that once belonged to the Druids. The monks, many of whom came from families with bardic or Druidic backgrounds, acted as cultural mediators, transcribing the legends of heroes, gods, and the natural world alongside the Word of God. In doing so, they ensured that the stories and philosophical underpinnings of ancient Celtic spirituality were not lost to time but were instead preserved and transmitted in new forms. It was within these monastic walls that Ireland's rich literary and theological tradition flourished, producing scholars like St. Columba and St. Brendan, who combined Christian zeal with a profound respect for their cultural heritage. Continuity, not erasure. Christianity also introduced new concepts of morality and afterlife that gradually shaped Irish society, but these ideas did not immediately erase the deep connection to the natural world and the cycles of life that the Druids had revered. Instead, Christian teachings were often framed in ways that echoed earlier beliefs about rebirth, transformation, and the sacredness of the earth. The figure of the saint, for instance, sometimes took on attributes similar to those of the ancient Celtic deities, protectors of land and people, miracle workers, and bridges between the human and the divine. Many saints' legends contain echoes of earlier myths, with stories of holy wells, sacred mountains, and miraculous interventions that recall the animism and mysticism of Druidic tradition. This blending of narratives helped Christianity take root more deeply in the hearts of the Irish people. The Christianization process was not without tension. There were moments of conflict and resistance, particularly from Druids and those who held tightly to the old ways. However, the Irish Church's flexibility and the decentralized nature of Irish society, with its many tribal kingdoms, allowed for a diverse and often peaceful coexistence. Pagan practices were not forcibly stamped out but gradually transformed, allowing for a prolonged period in which Christian and Druidic elements coexisted. This coexistence is reflected in the archaeological record, where Christian crosses and Druidic symbols often appear side by side, testament to a culture in transition rather than one in abrupt rupture. Moreover, the celebration of the natural world persisted within Christian practice. Irish Christians maintained a profound reverence for the land, rivers, and seasons, which can be seen in the customs and festivals that continued to honor the changing year. The Christian calendar absorbed many of the ancient seasonal rites, repurposing them with new meaning but keeping their underlying rhythms intact. Festivals like Samhain, originally a Druidic celebration of the end of the harvest and the thinning of the veil between worlds, evolved into All Saints and All Souls Days, retaining a spiritual focus on death, remembrance, and the supernatural. In this way, the Christianization of Ireland can be seen not as an erasure but as a transformation, an evolution of belief systems rather than an overthrow. The Druids' flame continued to burn, flickering in the shadows of monastic cloisters and in the whispered verses of bards. Their ancient wisdom found new expression in the prayers and art of a Christian Ireland, becoming part of a layered spiritual heritage that honored both the old gods and the new faith. This fusion of tradition and innovation left a lasting mark on Ireland's identity. The country became known for its unique brand of Christianity, one infused with poetic mysticism and a deep connection to the land. The legacy of the Druids lived on in this vibrant spiritual culture, influencing not only religious practice but also literature, art, and social structure for centuries to come. Ireland's gentle transformation offers a powerful example of how cultures can evolve by weaving together the past and present, preserving what is vital while embracing change. Thus, the story of Ireland's conversion is a story of continuity as much as change, a testament to the resilience of ancient wisdom and the adaptability of human belief. It reminds us that history is rarely a simple break but often a conversation across time, where flames passed from one generation to the next continue to light the way forward. Druids in exile, legends from Wales and Scotland. As the Roman Empire withdrew from Britain and the tides of history shifted, the ancient Druids, once the revered spiritual leaders of the land, found themselves pushed to the edges of the known world. Though their formal power diminished, their legacy did not vanish but instead took refuge in the remote and rugged landscapes of Wales and Scotland. These lands, shrouded in mist and wild beauty, became the final bastions of a fading tradition. Here, in the shadowed valleys and mist-covered hills, stories of Druids in exile were born. Tales whispered across generations, preserved in folklore and myth, a testament to the enduring spirit of ancient wisdom. Wales, a natural refuge for ancient wisdom. Wales, with its deep valleys and towering mountains, became a natural refuge for those who wished to preserve the old ways. The Druids, regarded with suspicion and reverence, were said to have retreated here, away from the encroaching spread of Christianity and the shifting power dynamics of the post-Roman world. Welsh folklore preserves numerous legends of these mystical figures, keepers of secret knowledge and guardians of the natural world. They were portrayed not as mere relics of the past but as living embodiments of ancient mysteries, whose connection to the land and its rhythms remained unbroken. The sacred groves and standing stones of Wales became the silent witnesses to this hidden continuity. Scotland, sanctuary in the Highlands. In Scotland, too, the rugged Highlands offered sanctuary. The Druids who survived there were often viewed through a veil of myth and legend, their presence cloaked in the mists that roll over the glens and lochs. Scottish tales speak of wise men and women who possessed uncanny knowledge of the stars, the herbs of the earth, and the secrets of life and death. These stories emphasize the Druids' role not just as spiritual leaders but as healers and advisors, figures who bridged the human world with the unseen forces of nature. The Highlands, with their untamed wilderness, seemed a fitting stage for these ancient custodians of knowledge to continue their work, even as the world changed around them. Cultural preservation through oral tradition. The survival of Druidic traditions in these remote regions was not just a matter of physical exile but also of cultural preservation. Oral storytelling played a crucial role in keeping the flame alive. Bards and storytellers passed down tales of Druids performing rites under the light of the moon, communing with the spirits of the earth, and guiding their communities through times of uncertainty. These stories were imbued with reverence and a sense of wonder, painting the Druids as timeless figures whose wisdom transcended the upheavals of history. They became symbols of a world that valued harmony with nature and a deep spiritual connection to place. One of the enduring themes in these legends is the idea of secrecy and hidden knowledge. The Druids were said to possess esoteric wisdom that could not be shared lightly, a knowledge encoded in symbols, songs, and rituals passed down only to trusted initiates. This secrecy was both a survival strategy and a reflection of the sacred nature of their teachings. Folklore often depicts Druids as elusive, capable of disappearing into the landscape like shadows, their knowledge hidden from the uninitiated. This aura of mystery helped preserve their influence, ensuring that even as overt power faded, the essence of their tradition lived on in subtle and profound ways. The stories from Wales and Scotland also highlight a complex relationship between the Druids and the Christian Church. While the Christianization of Britain advanced, in many remote areas there was a blending rather than a confrontation of beliefs. Some legends speak of Druids who became Christian monks or hermits, carrying forward their spiritual insights under new religious garb. Others describe tensions and conflicts, as the old and new worlds struggled to find coexistence. Yet, even in tales of conflict, there is often a recognition of the Druids' profound connection to the land and their role as keepers of ancient wisdom. Archaeological links and enduring legacy. Archaeological sites scattered across Wales and Scotland provide a tangible connection to these legends. Standing stones, stone circles, and ancient burial mounds are often linked to Druidic practices, though their precise origins remain a subject of debate. These monuments continue to inspire wonder and speculation, standing as silent reminders of a distant past. Many of these sites retained their sacred status throughout the Dark Ages and beyond, becoming focal points for local traditions and seasonal celebrations. Their endurance speaks to the lasting imprint of the Druids on the cultural landscape. In addition to their spiritual role, Druids in exile are often depicted as custodians of nature and the environment. Folklore credits them with deep ecological knowledge, the cycles of the seasons, the healing properties of plants, and the rhythms of animal life. This wisdom, passed down through generations, influenced the ways in which communities in Wales and Scotland related to their surroundings. The Druids' respect for nature resonated with the natural features of these regions, where harsh landscapes demanded a profound understanding of the environment for survival. This practical knowledge was inseparable from their spiritual beliefs, forming a holistic worldview that endured despite the pressures of cultural change. The legacy of the Druids in Wales and Scotland also permeates the cultural imagination in more modern times. From the Romantic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries to contemporary popular culture, the figure of the Druid has been reimagined as a symbol of mystery, wisdom, and connection to a lost world. These legends continue to captivate the imagination, inspiring artists, writers, and scholars alike. They remind us that the story of the Druids is not confined to the past but remains a living part of cultural heritage, a bridge between history and myth. Ultimately, the tales of Druids in exile reveal much about the resilience of ancient wisdom. Though their formal institutions were dismantled, and their role in society transformed, the Druids adapted and survived in the margins, preserving knowledge, sustaining traditions, and influencing the spiritual landscape of Britain long after Rome's fall. Their story is one of endurance, subtle influence, and the enduring power of connection to land and spirit. In the quiet hills and misty glens of Wales and Scotland, the Druids' flame continued to burn, an ember of ancient light guiding the way through the Dark Ages. The Tree of Life, connecting heaven and earth. Throughout ancient Druidic belief, the concept of the Tree of Life stood as a profound symbol that linked the earthly realm with the heavens above, a cosmic axis around which the world revolved. This sacred tree was not merely a tree in the physical sense but represented the interconnectedness of all existence, a living bridge between the material and spiritual worlds. In the world of the Druids, the Tree of Life was the embodiment of balance, harmony, and the cyclical nature of life itself. It served as a visual and spiritual metaphor for the unity of creation, drawing together the roots deep in the earth, the sturdy trunk reaching skyward, and the branches embracing the heavens. This image, rich with meaning, was central to their cosmology and worldview. The Druidic Tree of Life represented more than nature. It was the axis mundi, the world's center and the conduit for spiritual energy. The roots symbolized the underworld, a mysterious and fertile realm where ancestors and spirits dwelled. The trunk represented the human experience, the physical plane where life unfolds in all its complexity. The branches and leaves stretched upward into the heavens, symbolizing the divine and the infinite. This vertical connection conveyed the Druidic understanding that the spiritual and the earthly were not separate but intricately entwined. Life, death, and rebirth formed a continuous cycle, mirrored in the tree's seasonal changes, its shedding and renewal of leaves, and its enduring strength. Transformation into Christian symbolism. In the centuries following the fall of Roman Britain, as Christianity spread across the islands, many elements of Druidic cosmology were absorbed into emerging religious symbolism. The Tree of Life, with its powerful imagery, found a new life within Christian art, architecture, and theology. Medieval manuscripts often depicted elaborate tree motifs, echoing the ancient Druidic vision of connection between heaven and earth. This blending of imagery was not accidental but reflected a deeper syncretism, an effort by early Christian communities to bridge familiar symbols with new spiritual teachings. The tree became a way to express Christian ideas of eternal life, salvation, and divine order, while still resonating with older, deeply rooted cultural understandings. Christian symbolism often portrayed the Tree of Life alongside the Tree of Knowledge from the Garden of Eden, creating a layered narrative that resonated with audiences familiar with ancient traditions. The image of the cross itself, with its vertical and horizontal beams, can be seen as an echo of the world tree, representing both the axis mundi and the intersection of heaven and earth. In churches and cathedrals, the motif of the tree appeared carved in wood, painted in stained glass, and woven into tapestries, serving as a visual reminder of life's sacred interconnectedness. This symbolic continuity suggests that while the old Druidic practices may have been suppressed, their underlying cosmology endured and transformed within the new faith. Ecological and philosophical dimensions. The sacred tree was also closely tied to the natural world, a realm the Druids revered and sought to protect. It was believed that certain trees, especially the oak, ash, and yew, held special spiritual significance, acting as gateways to other worlds or homes to divine spirits. These trees were often the centers of sacred groves, places of ritual, meditation, and communion with the divine. The yew, with its longevity and association with death and rebirth, became particularly significant in Christian burial grounds, linking ancient beliefs about the cycle of life with Christian hopes for resurrection. This respectful treatment of trees and groves continued throughout the Dark Ages, preserving the ancient reverence for nature under new religious interpretations. Beyond symbolism, the Tree of Life also embodied practical wisdom. It represented the interconnectedness of ecosystems, the cycles of growth and decay, and the importance of living in harmony with nature. Druids were known for their deep ecological understanding, recognizing the delicate balance that sustained life. Their respect for the tree was not merely spiritual but also grounded in observation and knowledge, understanding how trees nurtured soil, provided shelter and food, and supported the intricate web of life. This ecological perspective subtly influenced medieval attitudes toward nature and agriculture, echoing through centuries of land stewardship and folk practices. The cosmological significance of the Tree of Life extended into the realm of human psychology and philosophy. It represented a map of the soul's journey, with the roots anchoring identity and tradition, the trunk symbolizing growth and experience, and the branches reaching for enlightenment and transcendence. The tree became a metaphor for personal development and spiritual awakening, a theme that found resonance in medieval mysticism and literature. Poets, philosophers, and theologians used tree imagery to explore themes of connection, transformation, and the eternal cycle of life and death, weaving ancient wisdom into the fabric of medieval thought. Enduring cultural impact. This enduring symbol also found expression in the art and literature of Celtic cultures. Illuminated manuscripts such as the Book of Kells feature intricate knotwork and interlaced trees that reflect the complexity and beauty of the Druidic tree of life. These artistic expressions were more than decoration. They were visual prayers, meditations on the sacred interconnectedness of all things. The looping branches and endless knots mirrored the continuous cycles of nature and spirit, inviting viewers into contemplation and awe. Through these creations, the flame of ancient Druidic wisdom continued to glow, even in the heart of medieval Christian culture. Moreover, the Tree of Life served as a unifying symbol across diverse tribes and kingdoms in post-Roman Britain. As political powers fragmented, the shared reverence for this cosmic symbol helped maintain a sense of cultural identity and continuity. It reminded disparate communities of their common roots and the eternal forces that bound them together. In this way, the Tree of Life became not only a spiritual emblem but a social and cultural anchor, nurturing cohesion in a time of upheaval and uncertainty. In summary, the Tree of Life stands as a profound testament to the survival and transformation of Druidic wisdom throughout the Dark Ages. Its image, bridging heaven and earth, embodies an ancient understanding of interconnectedness that transcended religious and cultural shifts. From sacred groves to illuminated manuscripts, from pagan rituals to Christian symbolism, the flame of the Druids burned quietly but persistently. The Tree of Life reminds us that beneath the surface of history lies a deeper story of continuity, of ancient knowledge adapting, enduring, and shaping the spiritual landscape of Britain long after Rome's fall. The role of women in Druidic and early medieval spirituality. In the ancient world of the Druids, women held a place of profound spiritual authority, wisdom, and influence. Unlike many later periods in European history where female voices were often marginalized, early Celtic and Druidic societies recognized the vital role women played as spiritual leaders, healers, and keepers of sacred knowledge. These women were not merely adjuncts to male counterparts but were integral to the religious and cultural fabric of their communities. Their legacy, though often obscured by the passage of time and the rise of patriarchal structures, persisted quietly and powerfully into the early medieval period, shaping the spiritual landscape of Britain long after Rome's departure. Female spiritual authority in Druidic traditions. The Druidic tradition was deeply intertwined with nature, and women's connection to the natural world was celebrated and revered. Female druids, often called bandrui, female druids, or priestesses, acted as mediators between the human and spirit worlds. They presided over rituals, interpreted omens, and safeguarded oral histories and sacred lore. These women were skilled in the arts of prophecy, divination, and healing, utilizing herbs, chants, and ritual acts to maintain balance within their communities. Their knowledge extended beyond the spiritual into practical realms. Midwifery, herbal medicine, and counsel were essential to community well-being, making them indispensable figures in both religious and social spheres. Transformation and enduring influence in Christian times. In early medieval Britain, as Christianity spread and sought to assert dominance, the role of women in spiritual life transformed but did not disappear. Christian convents became centers of female power and learning, where nuns took on roles remarkably similar to those of their Druidic predecessors. Women like Saint Brigid of Kildare and Hilda of Whitby emerged as spiritual leaders and educators, founding monasteries that became hubs for religious, cultural, and intellectual activity. These holy women carried forward the mantle of healing and teaching, blending Christian theology with enduring folk practices that echoed Druidic traditions. Their influence extended into politics and diplomacy, shaping the course of early medieval society. The legacy of female Druids and early Christian spiritual women is evident in the rituals and festivals that continued to honor cycles of nature and life. Many pagan festivals that celebrated fertility, the seasons, and the harvest were subtly integrated into Christian practice, often with women at the forefront of their observance. The celebration of St. Bridget's Day on February 1st, for example, aligns closely with the ancient Imbolc festival, a time marking the first stirrings of spring and new life. Women's participation in such festivals underscores the persistence of female-centered spiritual roles amid shifting religious paradigms. The tension between pagan and Christian traditions also manifested in the stories and legends surrounding women of mystical power. Figures like the enchantress Morgan Le Fay or the wise woman of Avalon in Arthurian legend carry echoes of the female druidic archetype, keepers of hidden knowledge, wielders of magic, and guides to kings and heroes. These narratives reveal a cultural memory that honored female spiritual authority even as overt pagan practices faded. The blend of myth, folklore, and history reflects how women's roles adapted to changing times while preserving an ancient flame. Healing was a particularly important domain for women in both Druidic and early medieval spirituality. Herbal knowledge, passed down through generations of women, formed the backbone of early medicine. Female healers combined empirical knowledge of plants with spiritual practices, treating both the body and soul. Many of these traditions were absorbed into Christian monastic medicine, where women continued as caregivers and herbalists despite the Church's ambivalent attitude toward folk practices. The continuity of healing lore illustrates how women acted as bridges between ancient wisdom and emerging religious frameworks. The quiet persistence of female power. Despite these contributions, the rise of patriarchal structures gradually limited women's formal spiritual authority. By the later medieval period, the institutional church increasingly sidelined female leadership, relegating women to subordinate roles. However, the resilience of women's spiritual influence persisted in local customs, oral traditions, and folk healing, keeping alive fragments of Druidic knowledge under the surface of official histories. In many ways, women's spiritual legacy became a quiet undercurrent, shaping communal identity and resilience in times of upheaval. The interplay between female Druids and Christian women also reveals a broader narrative of cultural adaptation and survival. Rather than a simple replacement of one system by another, this period saw a blending, negotiation, and transformation of spiritual roles. Women were central agents in this process, navigating the complexities of belief and power with grace and determination. Their stories, though often untold or obscured, invite us to reconsider the dynamics of spirituality and gender in early medieval Britain. Archaeological finds and historical records, though sparse, provide glimpses into the lives of these women. Burial sites with richly adorned female graves suggest reverence and status, while medieval texts occasionally highlight female saints, abbesses, and visionary women who commanded respect. Folklore and place names also preserve traces of female spiritual figures, linking geography with myth and memory. These scattered pieces form a mosaic that honors the ongoing presence of women's sacred wisdom through centuries of change. In conclusion, the role of women in Druidic and early medieval spirituality was both foundational and enduring. From their leadership in ancient pagan rites to their transformation into Christian abbesses and healers, women preserved a flame of ancient wisdom that illuminated the Dark Ages. Their influence shaped not only religious practice but also cultural identity, healing traditions, and mythic imagination. Recognizing this legacy enriches our understanding of Britain's spiritual history and honors the silent strength of women who carried the sacred flame through times of uncertainty and transformation. The disappearance of the Druids. Historical reality versus myth. The Druids have long occupied a place of fascination in both history and myth, their image shifting dramatically over the centuries. In medieval narratives, they often emerge cloaked in mystery, portrayed as shadowy figures wielding profound wisdom and supernatural power. Yet, when we try to separate fact from fiction, the true story of the Druids' disappearance and survival is far more complex and nuanced than the legends suggest. To understand what really happened to the Druids after Rome's withdrawal from Britain and through the Dark Ages, we must sift through layers of myth, medieval propaganda, and fragmentary historical evidence. The Druids were the priestly and learned class of Celtic society before and during the Roman occupation of Britain. Their roles encompassed religious leadership, legal arbitration, education, and the preservation of knowledge through oral tradition. They were deeply connected to nature, revered sacred sites, and conducted ceremonies that bound communities together. However, with the advance of Roman imperial power and the eventual collapse of Roman Britain, the Druids faced mounting challenges. Roman sources portray them as obstacles to imperial control, with the Emperor Claudius famously ordering the suppression of Druidic practices in the 1st century AD. This marked the beginning of a long decline in their public prominence. Transformation, not erasure. Despite Roman efforts to eradicate the Druids, evidence suggests that the tradition did not simply vanish overnight. Instead, it underwent transformation and adaptation. The withdrawal of Roman authority in the early 5th century plunged Britain into a period of political fragmentation and cultural upheaval. In this turbulent environment, Druidic knowledge and practices likely survived in more localized and secretive forms. The Druids' emphasis on oral transmission would have helped preserve their teachings even as formal institutions crumbled. Medieval Christian writers, however, often cast the Druids in a negative light. Many viewed them as pagan heretics or sorcerers, a portrayal that served the Church's agenda in establishing its own spiritual authority. Texts from this period frequently blend historical accounts with folklore, creating a distorted picture of Druids as dark magicians or mystical figures who opposed Christian progress. This demonization contributed to the Druids' image as shadowy remnants of a bygone pagan world, ultimately doomed to extinction. Yet, some medieval sources also hint at a more complicated reality. Rather than complete eradication, the Druids' wisdom may have been partially absorbed into Christian practice or preserved within folk traditions. For example, early Christian missionaries and monks often incorporated local customs and festivals into the Christian calendar, softening the transition and allowing some pagan elements to endure. The persistence of sacred groves, holy wells, and seasonal celebrations in Christian Britain suggests that the spiritual landscape was more syncretic than outright oppositional. Enduring archetypes and archaeological clues. Folklore from Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, regions where Celtic culture remains strong, contains stories of wise men and women who bear clear similarities to the ancient Druids. These figures often appear as healers, bards, or mystics, preserving a spiritual lineage that connects to the distant past. The figure of Merlin, for instance, though largely a product of medieval romance, reflects Druidic archetypes of the seer and magician. Such legends demonstrate that while the institutional Druids faded, their symbolic presence lingered in the cultural imagination. Archaeological evidence further complicates the picture. While direct material traces of Druids are scarce, owing to their oral tradition and lack of permanent temples, sacred sites linked to Druidic activity, such as Stonehenge and Avebury, remained important through the medieval period. These locations continued to inspire reverence and myth, suggesting a continuity of spiritual significance if not direct Druidic practice. The question of how the Druids disappeared is thus less about abrupt extinction and more about transformation, marginalization, and reinvention. The shift from paganism to Christianity did not erase all traces of Druidic culture but reframed them within new religious contexts. The Druids' oral knowledge, ritual practices, and symbolic language survived in disguised or adapted forms, influencing medieval spirituality and folklore in subtle yet lasting ways. Modern Romanticism and 18th and 19th century movements further complicated the historical understanding of Druids. Antiquarians and neo-pagan revivalists often idealized Druids as noble sages or guardians of ancient wisdom, sometimes projecting contemporary values onto a poorly understood past. This revivalist enthusiasm shaped popular perceptions but often blurred the lines between historical fact and creative mythology. Recognizing this helps us approach the Druids with a balanced perspective, appreciating both their historical reality and the enduring power of their myth. In sum, the disappearance of the Druids was not a single event but a gradual process marked by suppression, adaptation, and cultural assimilation. Their institutional power waned under Roman and Christian pressures, yet their spiritual legacy endured in transformed ways. By separating myth from history, we uncover a story of resilience, an ancient flame flickering through the Dark Ages, surviving in stories, symbols, and traditions that shaped Britain's spiritual heritage long after the Druids themselves ceased to appear openly in the historical record. Pagan philosophy and medieval thought. Long before the rise of Christianity in Britain, the Druids embraced a rich philosophy rooted deeply in nature, the cosmos, and the human relationship to the divine. Their worldview was not merely religious but encompassed ethics, cosmology, and a profound understanding of the cycles that govern life. As the Dark Ages unfolded and Christianity became the dominant faith, much of this ancient pagan philosophy appeared destined to vanish. Yet, beneath the surface of medieval thought, the twilight of the traces of these earlier ideas endured, shaping the intellectual and spiritual currents of the time in ways both overt and concealed. The Druids saw the natural world as a living, breathing entity, infused with spiritual significance. Trees, rivers, stones, and animals were not simply objects but carriers of divine energy and wisdom. This animistic and pantheistic perspective formed the backbone of their philosophy, emphasizing harmony with the rhythms of nature and the cosmos. The concept of the tree of life, for example, symbolized the interconnectedness of earth, sky, and underworld, a cosmology that echoed throughout Celtic spirituality and found later reflections in medieval Christian symbolism. As Christianity spread through the British Isles during the early Middle Ages, it brought with it new theological frameworks and philosophical systems, primarily influenced by Greco-Roman thought and Christian doctrine. The Church's emphasis on monotheism, salvation, and scriptural authority could seem at odds with pagan views, especially those that celebrated nature's sacredness and cyclical time. However, the medieval intellectual environment was complex and often more syncretic than it appears at first glance. Many early Christian scholars and monks were themselves inheritors of local traditions, and the meeting of pagan philosophy with Christian theology resulted in a fascinating blending of ideas. One way ancient pagan philosophy influenced medieval thought was through the preservation and reinterpretation of natural philosophy. While the Druids had passed down their knowledge primarily through oral tradition, the early medieval monks preserved and translated classical texts on nature, astronomy, and medicine, thereby keeping alive a discourse on the cosmos and human place within it. This intellectual inheritance, though filtered through a Christian lens, resonated with earlier pagan ideas about the cosmos as a dynamic, ordered system governed by cycles and forces beyond human control. Moreover, medieval alchemy and mysticism often bore the mark of pagan cosmology. The belief in a universe composed of interrelated elements, earth, water, air, fire, was central both to Celtic thought and medieval natural philosophy. The symbolic language of transformation and balance in alchemical texts echoes the Druidic emphasis on harmony and cyclical regeneration. In these subtle ways, ancient pagan concepts seeped into the intellectual fabric of the Middle Ages, influencing how scholars and spiritual seekers understood nature, the divine, and the human soul. Another area where the influence of pagan philosophy persisted was in the ethical and moral reflections of the time. Druids had emphasized balance, respect for all living beings, and the importance of wisdom and justice within their communities. While medieval Christian ethics were rooted in scripture and church teachings, they also absorbed elements of this older moral sensibility. The concept of stewardship, humans as caretakers rather than conquerors of nature, has parallels in both Druidic and Christian thought, suggesting a continuity of values concerning humanity's role in the natural world. The cyclical nature of time, a central theme in Druidic cosmology, also found echoes in medieval conceptions of history and spirituality. Pagan festivals marked the turning of the seasons, celebrating death and rebirth in endless succession. Christianity introduced a linear sense of time focused on salvation history, but the liturgical calendar retained echoes of the seasonal cycles, incorporating them into celebrations such as Christmas and Easter. This blending of temporal frameworks allowed ancient pagan rhythms to persist under Christian forms, preserving a connection to the natural world's cycles that was deeply embedded in the psyche of medieval communities. In literature and art, too, traces of pagan philosophy remained visible. Medieval poets and storytellers, many of whom were clerics or influenced by religious education, often drew on symbolic motifs and natural imagery that had roots in earlier Druidic traditions. The reverence for nature's mysteries, the use of symbolic animals and plants, and the exploration of human connection to the cosmos all point to an undercurrent of ancient philosophy running through medieval cultural expressions. Importantly, this survival was not uniform or universally accepted. The Church at times actively sought to suppress pagan ideas deemed heretical or dangerous. However, in the lived experience of medieval people, especially in rural and Celtic regions, the persistence of old beliefs and philosophies created a spiritual tapestry that was richly layered and diverse. Folk customs, healing practices, and popular festivals continued to carry forward pagan wisdom, often without explicit acknowledgement but nonetheless keeping the flame of ancient philosophy alive. The tension between pagan and Christian worldviews shaped medieval intellectual debates and spiritual practices, fostering an environment where ancient wisdom was both challenged and cherished. This dynamic interplay allowed for a gradual transformation rather than a clean break, ensuring that the philosophy of the Druids and their ancestors was woven into the emerging medieval consciousness. In the final analysis, the survival of pagan philosophy within medieval thought reveals much about the resilience of cultural ideas and the fluidity of spiritual traditions. The Druids' deep reverence for nature and cosmic order found new expressions within Christian frameworks, influencing how medieval society understood the world and its place within it. By tracing these subtle threads, we glimpse a continuity of ancient wisdom that bridges the gap between the fading world of Rome and the dawning medieval age, illuminating the enduring power of the Druids' flame. Druids and the medieval imagination, art and manuscripts. The figure of the Druid, once a central and revered part of Celtic society, transformed significantly in the medieval imagination. As centuries passed after the decline of Roman Britain and the spread of Christianity, Druids ceased to be active religious leaders, yet their memory endured, often wrapped in layers of myth, legend, and artistic interpretation. The medieval period, with its flourishing manuscript culture and rich visual arts, preserved many glimpses of Druids, sometimes faithful, often distorted, within the illuminated pages of manuscripts, in stories told by scribes, and in the symbolic artwork that adorned religious and secular texts alike. This segment explores how Druids were portrayed in medieval art and manuscripts, revealing much about how ancient wisdom was remembered, misunderstood, and mythologized during the Dark Ages and beyond. Medieval manuscripts were far more than simple books. They were portals into a world where history, theology, folklore, and artistry merged. The illuminated manuscript, often produced by monks in monasteries, was the chief medium through which knowledge and stories were recorded and transmitted. In these richly decorated volumes, Druids sometimes appear as enigmatic figures, wise sages, sorcerers, or foreboding pagans, reflecting a complex cultural attitude toward their legacy. The contrast between reverence for their ancient wisdom and suspicion of their pagan roots is palpable throughout medieval depictions. One of the key sources of Druid imagery in the Middle Ages comes from the annals and chronicles written by Christian monks. These accounts often portray Druids through the lens of Christian morality and theological interpretation. They were sometimes cast as opponents of the Christian faith, wielding magic and spells in defiance of God. This portrayal served both to underscore the triumph of Christianity over paganism and to warn against the dangers of lingering pagan beliefs. Yet, despite this cautionary depiction, many manuscripts also preserve traces of admiration for the Druids' knowledge of nature, astronomy, and healing. In illuminated manuscripts, Druids are often depicted wearing long robes, sometimes holding staffs or other ritual objects that signify their religious role. The imagery draws on classical and early medieval iconography of priests, philosophers, or magicians, blending historical imagination with symbolic meaning. These visual representations are not always accurate reflections of historical Druids, but rather a medieval attempt to visualize an ancient, often mysterious, spiritual authority. The emphasis on robes and staffs evokes both their ceremonial importance and their role as intermediaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. Beyond manuscripts, medieval art and literature carried Druidic imagery into the popular imagination. Tales of Merlin, the legendary wizard and advisor to King Arthur, for example, bear unmistakable echoes of Druidic archetypes. While Merlin is a largely fictional character shaped by medieval romance literature, his depiction as a wise, nature-connected figure with magical powers reflects the lingering cultural memory of the Druids. This blending of history and myth helped preserve the idea of the Druid as a powerful spiritual figure, even as the original practices were fading into the mists of time. The role of Druids in medieval storytelling was not limited to villainy or mysticism. Sometimes they were portrayed as keepers of ancient wisdom, guardians of secret knowledge that Christians themselves sought to uncover or assimilate. This dual role, both adversaries and respected sages, speaks to the complex relationship medieval society had with its pagan past. On one hand, the Church sought to eradicate paganism; on the other, it absorbed and repurposed many pagan symbols and ideas, creating a hybrid cultural memory that both revered and redefined the Druids. The symbolic language found in manuscripts often included motifs tied to nature, such as sacred trees, animals, and celestial symbols. These images resonated with the Druidic reverence for the natural world and were sometimes used allegorically in Christian texts to convey spiritual truths. The overlap between Druidic and Christian symbolism created a rich visual vocabulary that connected readers to ancient ideas, even when cloaked in new theological meanings. For example, the intertwining knots and spirals common in Celtic art, often associated with eternity and the interconnectedness of life, were seamlessly integrated into medieval manuscript decoration, linking ancient Druidic aesthetics with Christian artistic expression. Some manuscripts also contain direct references to Druidic rituals and lore, albeit filtered through Christian or classical interpretations. These references provide valuable insight into how medieval scholars understood and sometimes romanticized the Druids. The fascination with ancient knowledge and the desire to preserve fragments of it reflect a broader medieval preoccupation with history and the origins of faith and culture. This interplay between memory and imagination allowed the Druids' flame to survive, flickering through the pages of medieval literature and art. Interestingly, the medieval imagination did not confine the Druids to a single role or identity. In some texts, Druids are depicted almost as shamans or seers, individuals who possessed a deep connection to the spiritual and natural worlds. This portrayal highlights the enduring appeal of Druidic wisdom as something mysterious and potent, capable of transcending time and religious boundaries. The persistence of such images suggests that the Druids held a symbolic power far beyond their historical existence, representing an archetype of ancient, hidden knowledge that captivated medieval minds. The influence of Druidic imagery extended beyond the cloistered walls of monasteries and the pages of manuscripts. It permeated medieval folklore, poetry, and even legal traditions, often in subtle and indirect ways. Stories passed down orally would sometimes incorporate elements of Druidic lore, recast to fit Christian moral frameworks or regional customs. This living tradition ensured that the Druids were never entirely forgotten, even if their precise historical role was obscured by centuries of reinterpretation. It is also important to consider the role of geography and local identity in shaping medieval perceptions of Druids. In regions such as Wales, Ireland, and parts of Scotland, where Celtic culture and languages persisted longer, Druids were remembered with a mixture of nostalgia, fear, and respect. Local legends and place names kept their memory alive, and medieval scribes often drew on these sources to enrich their manuscripts. The regional variation in Druidic portrayal underscores the diversity of medieval attitudes toward paganism and the past. By the late medieval period, as the Renaissance dawned, the figure of the Druid continued to inspire writers and artists, sometimes in more romanticized and idealized forms. The revival of interest in classical learning and ancient history brought new scholarly attention to the Druids, who were increasingly viewed as symbols of a lost golden age of wisdom and harmony with nature. This intellectual reimagining would continue into the modern era, but its roots lie firmly in the medieval imagination, where the flame of Druidic tradition was kept alive through art and manuscripts. In sum, the medieval portrayal of Druids in art and manuscripts reveals a layered and complex cultural memory. Far from being forgotten relics, Druids were reimagined as magical, wise, and sometimes dangerous figures who embodied the tension between pagan past and Christian present. Through illuminated manuscripts, storytelling, and symbolism, medieval society preserved a vision of the Druids that both respected their ancient wisdom and reshaped it for new spiritual and cultural contexts. This legacy, at once historical and mythical, allowed the Druids' flame to survive the Dark Ages, illuminating the medieval world with echoes of a vanished ancient wisdom. Festivals and folklore, the living Druidic spirit. Long after the formal end of the Druidic orders and the sweeping rise of Christianity across the British Isles and Celtic lands, the spirit of the Druids continued to live on, not through temples or sacred groves alone, but through the rhythms of the year itself. The cyclical festivals that marked the changing seasons, the music that echoed across fields and forests, and the rich folk traditions passed from one generation to the next all served as living vessels for ancient Druidic memory. These celebrations and customs became the heartbeats of rural communities, silently preserving threads of ancient wisdom and spiritual connection that had once defined the Druids' relationship with nature, time, and the divine. This segment explores how seasonal celebrations, music, and folklore kept the Druidic spirit alive through centuries of transformation and cultural blending. seasonal cycles and enduring festivals. Central to understanding the persistence of the Druidic spirit is the calendar of seasonal festivals known to have been celebrated by the ancient Celts. Among these, Samhain, Beltane, Imbolc, and Lunasa stood as the four major fire festivals, each marking a crucial turning point in the agricultural and spiritual year. These festivals were deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life, tied to harvest cycles, weather changes, and the shifting balance between light and dark. Even as Christianity spread and gradually overlaid its own holy days upon the calendar, these ancient festivals did not vanish but often disguised themselves under Christian guises or merged with new religious observances. Samhain, celebrated around the end of October and the beginning of November, is perhaps the most famous example of this cultural blending. Originally a festival marking the end of the harvest and the thinning veil between the worlds of the living and the dead, Samhain's core themes of death, renewal, and liminality resonated deeply with the Druidic worldview. With the Christian calendar's All Saints and All Souls Days occurring shortly after, many Samhain traditions were incorporated into these observances. Bonfires, the lighting of candles to honor the dead, and the wearing of masks or costumes all continued in various forms, ensuring that the ancient Druidic themes of honoring ancestors and navigating the boundary between worlds remained vibrant within the popular imagination. Similarly, Beltane, celebrated in early May, marked the beginning of the pastoral summer season. It was a festival of fertility, protection, and the sacred union between the land and its people. The lighting of fires on hilltops, the weaving of garlands, and dancing around the maypole were integral parts of the celebration. While the explicit Druidic context may have faded, the essence of Beltane persisted through folk customs and community gatherings. In many rural areas, these practices continued quietly, often seen simply as seasonal traditions without overt religious significance. Through these communal acts, the living spirit of the Druids, keepers of natural cycles and sacred fire, endured in the collective memory. Music, folklore, and environmental connection. Music and song were equally vital in keeping Druidic memory alive within folk traditions. Bards, who were closely linked with the Druids historically, played a crucial role as storytellers, poets, and musicians, transmitting history, myth, and moral lessons through oral performance. Although the formal Druidic orders faded, the bardic traditions survived, evolving into the rich folk music cultures of Celtic regions. Folk songs often contained echoes of ancient lore, references to sacred places, and symbolic language that harked back to Druidic cosmology and values. Even when Christianity became dominant, these songs served as subtle reminders of a deep spiritual connection to the land and the cycles of life. Folklore, with its tapestry of legends, fairy tales, and superstitions, further nurtured the Druidic spirit. Many folk stories preserved themes central to Druidic belief: respect for nature's power, the presence of otherworldly beings, and the importance of wisdom passed from the elders. Tales of enchanted forests, talking animals, and magical rites kept alive the sense of a world where the seen and unseen intertwined, a core aspect of Druidic spirituality. The presence of sacred trees, wells, and stones in local legends also maintained the reverence for natural sites that Druids had once revered as holy places. These stories, passed from parent to child around hearths and in village gatherings, formed a living oral tradition that echoed the ancient past in every retelling. The resilience of Druidic themes in festivals and folklore can also be attributed to their deep-rooted connection to the natural environment. Druids were fundamentally attuned to the rhythms of the earth, its seasons, its cycles, and its sacred geography. This worldview was inherently local and tied to specific places, making it difficult for any outside force to erase completely. As Christianity spread, it often absorbed and reinterpreted these natural sacred sites rather than destroying them outright. Churches were built on former Druidic groves, holy wells were renamed but continued to attract pilgrims, and Christian festivals were superimposed on pagan dates, creating a layered spiritual landscape. This blending allowed the Druidic spirit to persist, hidden beneath new religious forms but accessible to those who remembered the old ways. The use of symbols in festivals and folk practices further illustrates the continuity of Druidic influence. The evergreen oak tree, for example, sacred to Druids as a symbol of strength and endurance, continued to hold symbolic importance in rural customs. Likewise, the intricate knots and spirals found in Celtic art appeared in folk decorations, crafts, and ceremonial garb, subtly invoking ancient beliefs about eternity and interconnectedness. The fire itself, so central to Druidic ritual, remained a powerful motif in community gatherings, symbolizing purification, transformation, and the eternal cycle of life and death. Enduring human needs and modern echoes. This persistence of Druidic influence in festivals and folklore was not limited to isolated rural areas but found echoes in wider cultural movements as well. In later centuries, especially from the Renaissance onward, there was a renewed interest in Celtic heritage and ancient wisdom. Poets, historians, and folklorists sought out the remnants of Druidic tradition, often romanticizing and reinterpreting it, but nonetheless keeping the flame alive in the cultural imagination. This revival helped ensure that Druidic ideas continued to inspire art, literature, and spirituality well beyond the medieval period. The enduring nature of these festivals and folk traditions also speaks to the human need for connection, to the land, to community, and to something beyond the visible world. The Druids' deep respect for natural cycles and their role as mediators between the human and divine realms found expression in these communal acts of celebration and remembrance. Whether lighting a fire on a dark autumn night or singing an old folk song passed down through generations, people kept alive a spiritual heritage that, while transformed, retained its original power and meaning. In conclusion, the living Druidic spirit survived the Dark Ages not in grand temples or formal orders but in the hearts and customs of ordinary people. Through the cyclical festivals that marked the passing year, the music that stirred the soul, and the folklore that captured the imagination, the ancient wisdom of the Druids continued to shape and enrich the cultural landscape. These traditions, often cloaked in new religious garb or everyday practice, ensured that the flame of Druidic knowledge and reverence for nature burned quietly but persistently through the centuries, connecting past and present in a continuous, living thread. The Druids' flame today: revival and rediscovery. In our contemporary world, the flame of Druidic wisdom, long thought extinguished by the sweeping tides of history, has been rekindled in new and unexpected ways. The ancient Druids, once guardians of sacred groves, masters of nature's mysteries, and keepers of profound spiritual insight, have found a renewed presence through modern revival movements. These modern Druids do not claim an unbroken lineage to the ancient orders, for such a direct connection is impossible to verify, but instead they embrace the spirit, symbols, and values of the Druids as a means to reconnect with nature, spirituality, and cultural heritage. This segment explores how the Druidic flame has been rediscovered, reclaimed, and reimagined in the modern era, highlighting the diversity of contemporary Druidry, its motivations, and its impact on both individuals and wider society. Sparks of revival, romanticism to formal orders. The 18th and 19th centuries marked the earliest sparks of what is now known as the Druidic revival. Romanticism, a cultural movement that celebrated emotion, nature, and the mystical past, found fertile ground in Celtic lands and beyond. Poets, artists, and historians became fascinated with the idea of the Druids as noble sages who held secret knowledge of the natural world and cosmic order. This fascination inspired the formation of the earliest modern Druidic groups, which sought to reconstruct or reimagine Druidic rites and philosophies based on surviving folklore, classical accounts, and creative interpretation. Unlike the Druids of antiquity, who lived in a polytheistic society and operated within complex social and religious structures, these new groups embraced a more spiritual and often nature-centered ethos, sometimes blending elements of neo-paganism, romantic mysticism, and environmentalism. One of the most significant developments in the modern revival of Druidry was the establishment of formal organizations, such as the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in London in 1781, and later the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded in the 1960s. These groups created rituals and ceremonies designed to honor the cycles of nature, celebrate the solstices and equinoxes, and cultivate a deep respect for the earth. The focus shifted toward individual spiritual experience, ecological awareness, and cultural connection rather than strict adherence to ancient rites, which had been largely lost to history. This democratization of Druidry opened the tradition to a wide audience, from scholars and spiritual seekers to environmental activists. Diversity, inclusion, and ecological commitment. Modern Druidry is not a monolith but a diverse tapestry of beliefs and practices. Some adherents follow more reconstructionist approaches, aiming to carefully piece together historical Druidic practices from archaeological evidence, classical texts, and Celtic folklore. Others adopt a more eclectic or symbolic approach, inspired by Druidic ideals rather than specific rituals. Across this spectrum, common themes emerge: a reverence for nature as sacred, a focus on the cycles of the sun and moon, and a belief in the interconnectedness of all life. Many contemporary Druids emphasize ecological activism, seeing their spiritual work as inseparable from efforts to protect and restore the natural world, a response to the environmental crises of our time. The role of women within modern Druidry is especially noteworthy. While historical records of ancient Druids are dominated by male figures, modern Druid groups actively welcome women and often highlight the importance of feminine energies, goddesses, and female spiritual leaders. This inclusive stance reflects both modern values and a recognition that ancient spiritual traditions were likely more complex and varied than often portrayed. Women in modern Druidry serve as priests, ritual leaders, herbalists, and teachers, helping to nurture the living tradition with new vitality and perspectives. Education and community form another cornerstone of the modern Druidic revival. Many organizations offer courses, workshops, and public ceremonies that invite participation and learning. These events provide spaces where individuals can explore Druidic philosophy, mythology, meditation, and ritual in a supportive environment. The use of technology and social media has expanded the reach of Druidry, connecting practitioners worldwide and fostering a sense of global community rooted in ancient wisdom and modern values. Popular culture and enduring relevance. Beyond organized groups, the Druidic flame also burns in popular culture and literature. Books, films, and art inspired by Druidic themes often emphasize the mystery, magic, and natural harmony associated with the Druids. This cultural presence has helped popularize the image of the Druid as a figure of spiritual depth and ecological sensitivity, inspiring many to explore the tradition for themselves. While these representations sometimes romanticize or simplify historical realities, they contribute to a broader cultural conversation about humanity's relationship with nature and the past. The revival and reinterpretation of Druidic traditions also raise important questions about authenticity, appropriation, and cultural heritage. Critics of modern Druidry sometimes argue that it is a form of invented tradition, lacking direct continuity with ancient practices and therefore less legitimate. Others caution against the commercialization or superficial use of sacred symbols. However, many practitioners respond that all living traditions evolve and adapt, and that modern Druidry's value lies in its ability to inspire meaningful spiritual connection and environmental stewardship today. In this view, the revival is less about reconstructing a perfect past and more about reawakening ancient wisdom in a form relevant to contemporary life. An important dimension of the modern Druidic movement is its global reach and adaptation. While its roots lie in the Celtic lands of Britain and Ireland, Druidry has attracted followers worldwide, who adapt its principles to their own cultural and environmental contexts. This global diffusion reflects the universal appeal of nature-based spirituality and the search for meaning beyond industrialized, technology-driven societies. Modern Druids often emphasize local sacred sites and landscapes, echoing the ancient Druids' respect for place while fostering a global community united by shared values. The environmental ethos at the heart of modern Druidry resonates strongly in an era marked by climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological crisis. Many Druids see their spiritual practice as a call to action, to protect the Earth's sacred places, to live in harmony with natural cycles, and to cultivate a deeper awareness of humanity's place within the web of life. This ecological commitment links the ancient Druidic legacy with urgent contemporary concerns, suggesting that the flame of Druidic wisdom continues to burn not only in memory but in active, transformative engagement with the world. In personal lives, many modern Druids find in their practice a source of peace, meaning, and community. The rituals, meditation, and connection with nature offer a way to slow down, to listen deeply, and to honor the mysteries of life. Whether through solitary walks in the forest, group ceremonies at solstice gatherings, or the study of ancient texts and folklore, practitioners experience a continuity with a lineage of wisdom stretching back through the mists of time. Ultimately, the story of the Druids' flame today is one of resilience, creativity, and renewal. Though the Druids of antiquity vanished into the shadows of history, their legacy has been rediscovered and reborn in countless forms. From scholarly reconstruction to vibrant community rituals, from environmental activism to artistic inspiration, the ancient wisdom once guarded by Druids continues to inspire and illuminate. In this modern renaissance, the Druid's flame shines as a beacon, reminding us of our deep ties to the natural world, our shared human heritage, and the enduring power of ancient wisdom to guide us toward a more harmonious future. The enduring flame. What the Druids teach us now. The legacy of the Druids is a quiet, enduring flame flickering through the corridors of history, illuminating truths that continue to resonate in our modern world. While much about these ancient figures remains shrouded in mystery, their teachings, values, and spirit have survived centuries of change, transformation, and sometimes deliberate erasure. Today, the story of the Druids invites us to pause, to listen to the whispers of the past, and to consider what ancient wisdom might offer in a time marked by rapid technological advance, environmental crisis, and a pervasive sense of disconnection. This final segment gently reflects on the lasting influence of the Druids and what they can teach us about living more harmoniously with ourselves, each other, and the natural world. Reverence for nature as a sacred presence. One of the most profound lessons the Druids offer is the reverence for nature as a living, sacred presence. In ancient times, Druids were deeply attuned to the rhythms of the earth, the cycles of the seasons, the phases of the moon, and the subtle changes in the landscape. Sacred groves, rivers, stones, and wells were not mere backdrops to human activity but vital places charged with spiritual energy and meaning. This holistic view saw humanity not as separate from nature but as an integral part of a vast, interconnected web of life. Today, as ecological crises mount and many feel alienated from the natural world, the Druidic call to honor and protect the earth has never been more urgent or relevant. Their ancient perspective encourages a shift from exploitation toward stewardship, reminding us that the health of the planet and the well-being of humanity are inseparably linked. Valuing deep knowledge and storytelling. The Druids also embodied a profound respect for knowledge, both seen and unseen. They were poets, philosophers, healers, and seers who valued wisdom passed down through oral tradition, story, and ritual. This oral culture preserved complex understandings of the cosmos, human nature, and the spiritual realms long before written records. In an age dominated by information overload and digital distraction, the Druidic emphasis on deep listening, contemplation, and storytelling offers a powerful antidote. It encourages us to slow down, to engage with the world in meaningful ways, and to recognize the power of narrative in shaping our identities and communities. The Druids' love of poetry and metaphor invites us to find beauty and insight in language, art, and music as pathways to knowledge and healing. Mediation, balance, and holistic healing. Another vital teaching lies in the Druids' role as mediators and bridges, between people and the natural world, between the visible and invisible, and between different communities and belief systems. Historical evidence suggests that Druids were respected figures who advised leaders, settled disputes, and maintained social harmony. Their spiritual authority was linked not to coercion or dogma but to wisdom, empathy, and a deep connection to both the earthly and spiritual realms. In today's fractured world, where divisions run deep and understanding often falters, the Druidic model of wise mediation holds enduring significance. It challenges us to cultivate empathy, to seek common ground, and to honor the diversity of perspectives while holding to shared values rooted in respect and care. Healing, too, was central to Druidic practice, both physical and spiritual. Their knowledge of herbs, natural remedies, and holistic health traditions was advanced for their time, blending observation with intuitive insight. This healing ethos, which later intertwined with Christian monastic medicine, reflects a broader philosophy of balance and harmony. Modern interest in herbalism, natural health, and integrative medicine echoes the ancient Druidic belief that well-being arises from living in accord with nature's laws. This holistic approach encourages us to consider health not merely as the absence of illness but as a dynamic state of equilibrium involving body, mind, and spirit in relationship with the environment. Enduring symbolism and cultural resilience. The Druids' enduring symbolism offers further insight into their timeless appeal. Symbols like the tree of life, the spiral, and the triskel represent cycles, growth, and the unity of opposites, ideas that continue to inspire spiritual seekers and artists alike. These symbols bridge past and present, inviting reflection on the mysteries of existence and our place within the cosmos. Their continued use in modern spirituality and art underscores the human need for meaning and connection beyond the material world. In many ways, the story of the Druids is also a story about resilience, the resilience of ideas, cultures, and spirits that endure despite suppression, colonization, and cultural shifts. Though the Druids as a formal order vanished with the rise of Christianity and political upheaval, their influence seeped quietly into folklore, mythology, place names, and cultural memory. The revival of Druidic traditions in recent centuries is testament to this resilience and to the human yearning for connection with ancient roots and the natural world. This rebirth is not about resurrecting an exact historical reality but about honoring the spirit of inquiry, respect, and reverence that the Druids embodied. For those drawn to modern Druidry, the ancient flame offers a path of personal and collective transformation. It encourages a spirituality grounded not in dogma but in experience, respect for the earth, and a sense of wonder. Rituals and ceremonies, while diverse in form, serve to reconnect individuals with the rhythms of nature and the cycles of life and death. Community gatherings provide a space for sharing, learning, and mutual support, reflecting the Druids' historical role as social as well as spiritual leaders. Through these practices, many find healing, purpose, and a renewed sense of belonging in a fragmented world. The Druidic legacy also invites reflection on the relationship between tradition and innovation. Ancient wisdom is not a fixed set of rules but a living dialogue between past and present. Modern Druids often blend old symbols and stories with contemporary values such as ecological activism, gender equality, and social justice. This dynamic interplay keeps the tradition vibrant and relevant, demonstrating how ancient knowledge can be a wellspring for creativity and renewal rather than mere nostalgia. In a broader cultural sense, the Druids' enduring flame serves as a reminder of the richness and complexity of human history. They challenge simplistic narratives that view the past as merely a stepping stone to modernity, instead inviting us to recognize the depth of indigenous European spiritualities and their ongoing contributions. This recognition fosters a more inclusive understanding of heritage and identity, one that values diversity of belief and the wisdom embedded in varied cultural expressions. Ultimately, the Druids teach us about balance, the balance between humanity and nature, between the seen and unseen, between tradition and change. Their wisdom speaks to the universal human quest for meaning, belonging, and harmony. In an era where many seek ways to reconcile technological progress with ecological sustainability and spiritual fulfillment, the Druidic flame offers a gentle but persistent light. It encourages us to remember that we are part of a larger story, one written not only in books and history but in the living earth beneath our feet and the cycles of the stars above. As we stand at the crossroads of past and future, the Druidic legacy invites us to carry forward the flame of reverence, wisdom, and hope. It calls on us to be guardians of the natural world, storytellers of deep truths, and healers of both earth and soul. In this way, the flame that once burned in the sacred groves of ancient times continues to illuminate our path today, guiding us toward a future where ancient wisdom and modern life coexist in harmony. How Ancient Wisdom Survived the Dark Ages series wrap up. The story of the Druids is a remarkable journey through history, one that reveals how ancient wisdom and spirituality quietly survived the sweeping changes of the Dark Ages and beyond. Despite centuries of political upheaval, religious transformation, and cultural shifts, the essence of Druidic knowledge, their deep connection to nature, reverence for the sacred, and commitment to storytelling and healing, endured, leaving a lasting imprint on the spiritual and cultural landscape of Europe. At its core, the Druidic tradition was a celebration of the natural world as a living, sacred presence. Druids saw themselves not as masters of the earth but as humble participants in an interconnected web of life. This worldview, expressed through their sacred groves, seasonal festivals, and symbolic language, emphasized balance, respect, and harmony, values that remain profoundly relevant today. As Christianity spread across Europe, many of these Druidic practices and sites were not destroyed outright but absorbed and transformed, blending pagan rites with new religious meanings. This gentle coexistence allowed the flame of ancient wisdom to flicker on, hidden but persistent. The oral tradition was crucial to this survival. Through storytelling, song, and poetry, Druids and later monks preserved myths, histories, and philosophies that might otherwise have been lost. These stories not only kept memories alive but also shaped medieval culture and imagination, giving rise to enduring legends like Merlin and inspiring medieval art and manuscripts. The symbolic language of Druids, with its runes, knots, and natural motifs, found new life in Christian iconography, ensuring that their worldview subtly influenced medieval thought. The relationship between Druids and Christian monks was complex, marked by both tension and collaboration. While Christianity ultimately became dominant, many early monks were also healers and scholars who recognized the value of Druidic herbal knowledge and spiritual insight. This blending of traditions enriched medieval medicine and spiritual practice, demonstrating how ancient wisdom can adapt and integrate with new ideas. The Druids' legacy also includes a deep respect for healing and medicine, rooted in their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies. This tradition, passed down through monastic communities, laid foundations for holistic approaches to health that echo in modern herbalism and integrative medicine. Moreover, the role of women in Druidic and early medieval spirituality highlights an often overlooked aspect of ancient societies: the significant influence of female healers and spiritual leaders. Today, the flame of the Druids continues to burn in modern revival movements and popular culture. While these contemporary practices may not replicate ancient rites exactly, they honor the spirit of reverence, connection, and balance that defined the Druids. Their story invites us to reflect on the importance of preserving cultural memory, valuing nature, and seeking harmony within ourselves and with the world around us. Ultimately, the tale of the Druids teaches us that wisdom, once kindled, is difficult to extinguish. It can survive through transformation, adaptation, and the enduring power of story. As we face the challenges of the modern world, the Druidic flame offers a guiding light, encouraging us to live with respect for the earth, to seek deeper understanding, and to remember that the ancient past still speaks to us, if only we choose to listen.